All right, why don't we go ahead and get started? I know we've got a member or two who will probably be joining us momentarily, but it is 7:30, and I think it's time to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Wednesday, October 8th work session of the Falls Church City Council. We're delighted that you're all here with us tonight. The meeting is open to the public, but the public is not able to get up and speak. This is not like a regular hearing, so you're invited to listen. But generally speaking, you will not be able to speak. We have a regular scheduled meeting on Monday, at which point you are able to make comments if you'd like. Why don't we go ahead with the first item on the agenda, Mr. Shields?
Okay, thank you, Mayor Tarter. And I would maybe note just at the beginning, you have two pieces of hardware in front of you, and maybe we could talk about that on Tuesday with at the big meeting. But we did get an achievement award from the Virginia Municipal League. Councilmember Duncan was there to receive that, along with Lauren Bruce in our planning department. And that was recognition for our work as a community to find a new home for the Easter Seals preschool for the Child Development Center. And it was the work of many hands. And so it was great to get that statewide celebration of that achievement. And then to the mayor's right, our left, the Council of Governments has granted the city or recognized the city with a leadership or an environmental leadership award. I'm saying that wrong, but that's the gist of it. And that is for our work to be recognized to really rally the community to purchase green energy for their electricity. And through that work, we achieved the threshold of 5% of all electricity in the city is purchased from renewable sources, wind and solar primarily, and we were recognized by the EPA as a green community, meeting the Green Community Challenge Award. And COG recognized us for that today. And
That's right, and I tell you, if I could, maybe just to give special recognition to Tim Stevens. Tim, maybe if you could stand up for just a moment. I think Tim was instrumental in as were others, Dan, Mr. Z as well, but instrumental in getting this award for the city. And it, as Mr. Shields just mentioned, involved the whole community involvement. The EPA's Green Power community is community-wide. The city as well, as an organization, participated and also achieved that status. So a great award with a lot of help from our community, so thank you so much.
all right, the first item on tonight's agenda is the Miller House RFP, and I'm joined by Dana Lewis with our Housing and Human Services staff, and Jeannie Cummings Eisenhower with the Falls Church Fairfax County Community Services Board. I'll just say a few introductory words and then turn it over to Dana for a report. But the request is for council to consider the staff report and see if there's consensus on council to proceed with finishing up or refining the RFP, the scope of work of which is in your packet, and then proceed through a selection process after issuing that RFP, and then come back to council with results of that process, potentially for an award of a lease for the use of the Miller House. And the Miller House has been vacant now for, I think, about 7 years. It is in, essentially, it's a building that needs to be torn down. It is it's in bad shape. It traditionally was used as a group home for adults with intellectual disabilities in its past, and then has had other uses through the years, but it was purchased by the city to perform a social function. When it became vacant, I did ask staff to put together a focus group back in 2013, composed of planning staff, the neighboring property owners, outreach to Sunrise, the Christ Crossman Church, and other stakeholders to come up with some ideas on the best use for this property. We came to the council in August of 2013 with a report and a recommendation that the use should continue to be in the social services sector. And the council asked us to do two things back in August of 2013. One is to consider economic development potential for the lot and other uses. And so the city put out an RFI to get market interest on the possible reuse of the property. and reached out to the commercial sector and commercial brokers to gauge the level of interest to use the property for commercial purposes. What we learned through that process was that the interest from the commercial sector was weak. We didn't get a strong response, and we think that's because the parcel is a small parcel, and to put it into commercial uses, it would require major reworking and probably tearing down the building and starting over again. So that would need to be financed. And the RFI did bring forward a respondent who said, we think we could redevelop the property as a group home for adults with intellectual disabilities, and had a proposal to do that. And so that was the result of that RFI. We came back to the council in May 2014, and the council said, what we would really like to now get this idea out to the community, get more community input on this option. And so we have done that, and want to come back to the council with a report on that community input. We had a public hearing in August of 2014. So with that introduction, let me turn it over to Dana just for a little bit more detail, and then we'll go from there.
Good evening. One other thing I'd point out is that the site was actually in the North Washington Streetscape Plan as being for a site for a pocket park. And you have in your attachment a memorandum from the Director of Planning, Jim Snyder, who feels that that's not really feasible when you look at the easements that would be required and that type of thing to connect with Madison Square Park. With the public comment, we had a 30-day public comment period, and we had a community forum. Comments received from the Planning Commission, Housing Commission, Fairfax Falls Church Disability Services Board, and Citizens Advisory Committee on Transportation were in favor of constructing a group home on the site. Comments received from the Economic Development Authority and the Falls Church Chamber of Commerce indicated they were not in support of the property being used as a group home, but recommended an alternative site be located for a possible group home. So our next steps would be, if there's council consensus to go forward with the RFP, we would put together a selection committee. We have a scope of work already developed, and we will be adding more to that. The selection committee would be formed to evaluate responses received once the RFP is put out, and then council would be briefed on the responses. Negotiations would occur with the top-ranked respondent, and then a contract would be brought forward for council consideration and ultimate approval. I just had a few pictures so you would know what the site looks like. This is what the current structure on the site looks like. It's in great disrepair and needs to be demolished. This is an aerial view of the site. You have Sunrise on the left side and Christ Crossman on the right side. Christ Crossman has indicated that they would be willing to provide parking for the site. That would not be a cost attached to that. This is a rendering from the planning department of what would fit on the site, what a possible group home, if one were to be developed, what it could look like. The need. And we also have Jeannie Cummings Eisenhower here from the Community Service Board to answer any questions that you might have about the need. Falls Church has a net outflow of disabled residents, meaning that if there is a person that is in need of a group home in the city, they would need to go outside of the city for those services. Currently, 11 persons from the city are on the Community Services Board wait list for intellectual disability residential services. And there are 17 children in Falls Church schools with an intellectual or developmental disability who may soon need housing. The pictures are from the Georgian Way Group Home in Fairfax County. And this is just a listing of the members that were in the study group. And you can see that we had a cross-section of persons with interest. We had Sunrise, Homestretch, the Columbia Baptist Church, Christ Crossman, and developers were there, Planning Commission, HSAC, and city staff. At this time, I have Jeannie Cummings Eisenhower here to answer any questions that you might have regarding the need or how priority is determined for a possible group home. And I'm able to answer any other questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you. Eisenhower, do you have anything you might want to add?
Well, I was mostly going to answer questions, so I'm willing to take questions on the need. I can tell you that if we were looking at priority in terms of how we might want to ask a respondent in the RFP to construct a plan for accepting people for the house, what we would want to consider, I think, is how we would look at residency in terms of Falls Church city residents. And when we look at the people who are currently city residents, as you saw the need up there, you've got 11 people who are currently city residents who are on our wait list, and you've got another 17 who are children in the schools. The issue is that it takes a certain kind of funding source in order to be able to get in a group home generally, because the cost of living in a group home is about $60,000 a year or up. So most families can't afford to pay that. So you generally need to have Medicaid helping you pay that cost. But there's a long wait list, and people have to get up to the top of the wait list before they get funded to do that. So there's no guarantee that the person at the top of the wait list is somebody from Falls Church City. We just can't guarantee that, and we don't have control over that wait list and how people get selected off of it. It's a state process. It's a state mandated selection process. So what we would propose to do is ask a respondent to provide a preference or a priority in their selection process for this group home, so that they would make it, all other things being equal, make sure that they would, if they had a person who was coming from the city of Falls Church, give that person a preference or a priority to be able to get have an admission into the house, as long as, considering all clinical criteria, they were a good fit for the other residents, and that they were an appropriate match for that particular house. Because obviously you're going to have people with pretty intense medical and behavioral needs, and you want to make sure that everybody can live together in a safe and healthy and happy environment. So we could be looking at things like asking people first who were coming from other places, who we actually had to ask to move to other places first, if they would like to come back to the city of Falls Church. They would be a priority for us to be able to offer that option to. We can also look at asking people who are able to pay privately, if they are able to do so, if they would like to have an opportunity to move into this house. We can look at the people who are, there are 2 individuals currently in the Northern Virginia Training Center who have a Falls Church city of origin, and we're able to ask them if they would have a preference or to live in this house, and we'd be able to give them a priority. And then we would look at our waiting list, and if somebody came up to rise to that level of urgency that they got selected first for that funding slot, we would make this home available to them as a priority as well.
Great, thank you so much. Are there questions from council? Ms. Oliver?
I have one question, which is related partially to the Chamber of Commerce comment, but mostly just from my own experience walking up and down that road. It's an extremely busy street. It's an extremely noisy street. It's very, very hectic, and I recognize this is probably not an ideal location, but is this a manageable location from a safety and security perspective?
There's been a group home there for many years, and as to my knowledge, it's never been an issue. The one good part about that street is that there's plenty of public transportation access, and many of our folks are learning how to use public transportation, so that makes it an incredibly useful tool. And it's also situated very nicely next to 2 congregations of 2 faith communities, which means that folks will have plenty of access to be able to participate in lots of community activities, which also makes it very nice. Folks will have 24-hour typically awake overnight supervision, so there shouldn't be issues of safety from that perspective, and we can build in design features to make sure that people can remain safe.
Other questions, Mr. Duncan?
Just to follow up on, excuse me, to follow up on Ms. Oliver's question, you alluded to a little bit of the historical experience that we have with facilities such as this in the city. You, other staff, former council member Lippman perhaps. My recollection is there used to be 3 or 4 such facilities, and there was one next to the Falls Church Presbyterian Church on Broad Street. There was another one, wasn't there, just down the street from...
That's right, on Columbia Street.
It was 3.
Right, okay, so our past experience has been, we had multiple such facilities typically located on, fairly busy streets, and I don't remember any bad experiences, but, that goes back even before my time. So do we have any, historical experience with locating a facility like this being in any way negative in terms of safety, which is a legitimate concern?
Not typically. I mean, what we like to see is we need to make sure that there are sidewalks. That's critical. We need to make sure that places are well lit.
That would be a 20-foot sidewalk, too, remember that?
Right.
Every time I mention that, the tartar gives me $5.
We need to make sure that places are well lit, that there are good crosswalks. So really, it's the things that we would typically be looking for in our own houses, in our own places. And because people are going to have 24/7 support and supervision, there's less of a concern about folks, trying to do a deep dive across North Washington Street than we might otherwise have. So I don't think that we're going to have those kinds of issues or concerns. We've never had those kinds of issues or concerns in the past with any of the houses located on any of those particular streets. And we don't typically have them in those kinds of areas.
Okay.
There are group homes in really urban areas, much more urban than ours, and we don't typically see those kinds of issues.
Thank you. I'm sorry, go
Oh, no, I
ahead.
was just going to say, I'd add, too, that Christ Crossman has volunteers at the church that have already indicated that they'd like to provide services for the home. And then we have Sunrise on the right, which is a similar type of facility, and we've not had any issues.
Okay, just one further question. The common theme in the comments by the Chamber Board and the EDA, 2 groups that normally I and others give great weight to, is that there might be other locations in the city more suitable for a facility such as this. Do you all have anything, is there a plan B? I mean, is there any other place that you've identified that would be feasible?
We don't know of any right now. I mean, we were asked to find a possible use for this current site by the city manager, and that's what we were tasked to do. So we didn't really look at the feasibility of other sites. We were really looking at this site, what could be done with this site.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Other comments? Mr. Z?
Thank you, Mayor. Push the button. So I just have a very few set of questions. What would the parking requirement be if you had to build it out for this facility? You have
Yeah, I believe that should be in your attachment. The scope of work is in there of what would be included in the RFP. So, let's see.
well, if it's in there, I can look it up for myself.
Yes, we have the scope of work and property features, all of that, and what it's zoned for in your attachments.
Yeah, I couldn't find it, but
Okay.
do you recall whether it's 6, 12, some number?
Yeah, okay.
While you're looking for that, the lease is for 60 years, which seems to be a very long time, and I can't help but think that it's difficult for me to project what the city would look like 60 years from now, and so which doesn't affect the support for this meeting this need, but if there's a way we could structure a re-examination of the requirement downstream. This facility, no matter how well it's constructed, I just don't believe it's going to last for 60 years in any event. That's true of most buildings. We're a commercial building, multifamily. We're probably looking at a 25, 30-year lifetime max, and of course the facilities change over time. I would imagine that 60 years from now we would have a different perspective on how we take care of these issues. So if there's a way to do an off-ramp or a reexamination of the basically lease agreement, I think that would make all of us feel a little bit more comfortable.
We, as far as the parking, it would be limited parking there for staff, and most of the residents would not have cars. And then Christ Crossman has already offered use of spaces in their lot at no cost for the facility. As far as the lease terms, we did do research with developers who build group homes, and they said that the lease terms would have to be for at least 45 years, which would include 30 years of financing, and then the lender requires 1.5 times the finance term for the lease. So it would have to be for at least 45 years. And then the developer would want to have information, a strong commitment from the city of what happens at the end of the lease term. Things like, would there be a second lease? Would there be ability to have a buyout? Would there be a sale of the property? And how would the fair market value of the property be determined? So those would all be things that we'd have to kind of, say up front to the developer. So that's what we found.
Certainly, I understand that. I think that is just, you just mentioned some time periods there that would be logical periods for us to reexamine where we are with respect to this facility. And I'm certainly understand that if I were a developer, I would want a very long-term lease, but at the same time, I think it would be appropriate to remind them that the city has requirements as well. We can re-examine those at some point in time, perhaps at the end of the first finance period, and then subsequent options. That happens all the time, to my knowledge. So finally, the last question is since we have a brand new city attorney, you need to exercise that a little bit. Goes to one of our residents' comments with regard to liability from Ms. Tina Ehrman. I do have one concern for future consideration. I hope our new city attorney, Ms. McCoskey, by name, will be asked to weigh in on any liability the city might incur if the group home project goes forward. I'm not sure I understand the question, but
Why don't we not put our city attorney on the spot just
no,
yet?
that's a great segue. So why don't we do that? All right.
Are there other comments? Sure, Ms. Connolly?
Every time I look at this, I keep getting stuck on one thing, and I think we all agree that having a group home in Falls Church is a good thing and something that we would all like to have. But what you just said, when we don't know of any, I think that it was the wrong we're researching the wrong question. The question should be, is there the right place for a group home in Falls Church? Are there other places for a group home in Falls Church? Because we're ending up with this place because that's all that was suggested might work there, or that's one of the things that a lot of people have coalesced around. But I think a broader question would be, could we all agree that we would like a group home, at least one, maybe two, in Falls Church. Where is the best place for that? And is there another place for that? So I'm almost hesitant to say, yes, I want this to go forward, because it seems like there's a larger question that needs to be asked and answered. And I hate to throw that wrench in this right now, but every time I get to this, I get stuck on that.
Other comments? I have a question or two or comment or two. Mr. Brewer, go ahead.
So I just wanted to make a couple comments. One, I think going the RFP makes sense, so I'm in support of it. A couple things I'll point out. I'm not sure I fully understood the priority, but let me just be clear, when this comes back, it's got to be crisper than that. This gets into some other issues where we're getting hit with various unfunded mandates, and we are talking about a city subsidy. So frankly, my patience for hearing about how the state's prioritizing when we're talking about, with what Mr. Z pointed out, a 60-year potential subsidy, I want to make sure that our citizens and our taxpayers are first in line, irregardless of what the state is doing and how it's being subsidized. And I'm sure our wonderful staff and others can come up with ways of managing that. But I want to make sure our citizens have clear priority who've been in one way or another paying into the system, and that's where the need is. So I just want to put that front and center. I'm not sure if it comes out and the RFP is something different, where, given how this is going to be structured, that, well, maybe our citizens would get a priority and have the ability to be in the facility. I'm really looking at something of this nature and this size being priority given to Falls Church, or I may view it differently. So let me finish. The second thing, this is Mayor Tartar's favorite issues and other members as well. I'm not sure if the RFP fully covers the need to streetscape that area. It's somewhat sidewalk issues. I can't recall if there's poles there, utility poles that need to be undergrounded, etc. That should all be included as part of the RFP, just so everybody knows what the expectations are, and there's not issues about, well, that needs a further subsidy to do undergrounding or etc. That should be built into whatever the plan is. And then as a footnote, and again, I don't want to get into it this evening, but I do think that citizen comments that we've gotten about, well, how does this comport with the small area plan, which calls for a park, need to be examined. I think we as a city lose a lot of credibility when we put forward a plan and then alter. And I appreciate Jim Snyder's comments that it's not doable. I had another chance to look at those tonight. But I just emphasize that when we have these swings in plans, we'd lose credibility. So at a future date, I want to examine, kind of a lesson learned of why we had labeled it as a pocket park, and I'm fine moving away from that, but I don't want to see other plans that we're developing, not being taken enough time or whatever the issue is, where things like this are coming up. But again, I don't necessarily want to get into that because I think that distracts from what we need to do tonight, but we can talk about that at a later date.
Okay, other comments, questions? I have a few comments and questions, and if others don't. I share some of the concerns I'll get to in just a second raised by my colleagues, but first let me ask, what is the anticipated cost to the city going forward for this facility? In other words, obviously we're putting in land. Okay, there's a cost to that. There's either an opportunity cost or just an actual value to the land. Are there any anticipated costs on an annual basis going forward at any time in the future? And is that part of the RFP?
There would be no additional cost to the city other than the lease, and property taxes would not be, would not be collected.
The opportunity cost, as you put it, is the cost. We've tried to be very clear throughout the process in the RFI process that there'd be no city subsidy for it.
Okay, and that would be written into whatever agreement there is, that there would be no
Yes.
contributions or requests for
No,
contributions to
so
the
we
city
don't
going forward.
anticipate them, applying for affordable housing funds or anything like that. This would be the only, thing the city would be putting in.
Okay, I would also echo the concerns about the small area plan. I think that's entirely accurate. There may be reasons. I know we're not paying big bucks for these area plans, and we don't have the resources to study and analyze each property, but I do think we do lose credibility, that we have this expectation for developers that they're going to honor what we put in our plan, and then when we don't honor it ourselves, I think that's a difficult place to be in. So,
And I would, if I have a minute, like to address that just very briefly, Council.
okay. Also, I would echo Mr. Z's comments about 60 years. I just think that is way too long for a commitment, and frankly, 45 years is too long. I think that the property, the useful life of a structure like this likely would be in the 30-year range, and whether someone wants to have 1.5 times that, and that's great. Someone wants to be able to buy the property, that's great. We don't, as a city, have to allow them to do that, and I think this is an important piece potentially in our redevelopment as time goes on. It's got some proximity to the metro, and so I wouldn't want to have a right for someone to purchase it. I wouldn't want a right for this lease to go probably, frankly, any longer than 30 years. So that would be my input as to that. Also, let me ask you, say the parking we provided at Christ Crossman, are they willing to give a 30-year commitment to parking? Other than, we'll give you parking, but are they going to do it for the length of this project?
I've not talked to them about length of the parking, but, I mean, as long as the church is there, I would
I mean,
think
that's
that-
the issue, though, isn't it? If the church decides to redevelop or put affordable housing on their lot or redevelop their property in some fashion, the parking for this place would be lost. And so I think you need to explore how long a commitment they're willing to give you. If this were a private developer, I don't think we would say, you know, just as long as you got the parking, this will be great, but the same issues would arise. In other words, if the church chooses to redevelop, then this place may no longer have parking. And unless there's an agreement that goes for a period of years, then I'm not sure we have that commitment. So I guess I would like, if you can, to explore what period of time the church is willing to give a commitment to provide parking, which I think influences our decision as well. So I think that is what I have. Mr. Snyder, you want to address the small area plan issue?
Yes, and this is kind of a unique situation because the city, prior to us undertaking the small area plans, instituted and had a study done by consultants to look at a new streetscape standard and design for the North Washington Street area. And that was done by a number of consultants. There were, before my time, there were sessions here at the community center, a lot of debate about the streetscape and so on and so forth. As a feature of that, this property, which the city owned, which wasn't being used, was called out for the possibility of a pocket park. Understand at one point it was also being talked about possibly for the intermodal center. Because that plan had been bought and paid for by the city, was recently adopted by the Planning Commission and City Council, when we did the small area plans, we included it as the adopted streetscape standard for the small area plan. Since the Northgate project has been built, and as we look more closely at it, I think there are some questions about some of the details, particularly the streetscape plan, and that we may want to revisit. So as we looked more closely at it, and this was first raised, the idea of being trying to get back to the park really is not practical, so it would take condemnation or easements or whatever to accomplish that, plus the construction of such a park. So as we looked at it, we thought a better use would be for something that's really we don't have in the city. I was very shocked to find we had no group homes here in the city. It's not what I'm used to in Alexander, Arlington, where I live and worked before. And this was a piece of fallow land that had been so used before as a group home. And so as we looked at it, we thought this is a better use for it. There are better places to do a pocket park that, for example, maybe on Broad Street or other places where we'd get more use of such a thing. I'm for pocket parks, but I don't think it's a particularly good one. So that's some background on it.
We appreciate the background. I still would reiterate the fact that, you know, our plans, we hope to carry that force and that weight with developers, and I think we as a city need to honor it in a similar fashion. Are there any other comments? We're past our allotted time. Anyone else have any additional comments? Do we want to move forward subject to the comments that have been received around this table? Is there a consensus for that? Anyone? Others?
And-
Okay, well, then I think you've got your direction.
Okay.
So thank you so much for coming out this night. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Sue.
Take care. Let's go ahead and move on to the next item if we can. And I saw the developer's attorney. I don't know if he's outside, but if he is, maybe someone could let him know that we're about to take up his case. Thank you all for coming out.
Cindy, do you want me to leave this here?
Thank you.
Okay, you ready?
Mayor Tarter, Gary Fuller is going to provide the meat of the staff report. Our intention tonight is to share with the council the input that we got from boards and commissions, and I think we should pause and thank everybody for their participation in the process. There's been tremendous involvement by neighborhood groups, by adjacent property owners, by our boards and commissions, and the council has received all of the comment that we've gotten, and that's sort of the big deck. And then we've tried to consolidate that down into some summaries, and then we condense that even further and to what we think are probably at the highest level for the city council, the core issues, the main objectives that we as staff believe we should focus our efforts on with the developer to get this in a shape that has, potentially council support for final action in December. And so what we'd like to spend time with the council on tonight is on those top core objectives that we've listed out in the staff report, and then discuss the schedule. The developer is here with us. We don't have a presentation, I don't believe, unless there are any changes that the developer wanted to share with the council as a result of input so far. We also have the chairman of the Planning Commission, Ruth Rogers, and if it's the council's pleasure, we could hear directly from the chair of the Planning Commission's report. The Planning Commission held its last public hearing on Monday, deferred action on it pending a resubmittal of a new application, but the Planning Commission chair is here as well to report to the council.
Thank you.
So if we, perhaps we could start with Mr. Fuller's presentation on the top issues and schedule, and then go from there.
Thank you, Mr. Fuller. Welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're on, okay. Staff has prepared an exhaustive and comprehensive analysis and summary of the public and staff comments and recommendations to date. The first document in attachment 2 is a complete list of all board, commission, community organization, public, and staff comments to date. And the second document is a complete list of all those comments summarized, and that's in attachment 3, which is a summary of those, which I call 100% comments. From there, staff analyzed these comments and recommendations and refined them into 6 summary categories of clearly identified issue areas, and we're calling them objectives. And we took those objectives and we put those into detailed list of actionable items and strategies for the developer. And it was an exhaustive process in which we distilled this information down. The document, it was in your package, but you've gotten a duplicate copy tonight. Just so you have it handy, it's on the dais as one of the handouts or the tables tonight. And so this is the main document that I'm addressing. This is the 6 objectives that we're asking you to consider as guidance. In that context, with your discussion tonight, we would welcome any further comments and guidance you might want to add to these. The hope is that you would use these as the guidance coming out of this work session to the developer. At this point, the developer is anticipated to make final revisions to their conceptual plans and their supporting application documents for resubmission later this month. As the city manager had indicated, the Planning Commission had deferred this item pending those final plans until November 17th, in which they have continued their public hearing and will finalize their recommendations to the council. So those are still pending. So with that, I would indicate that these recommended action and strategies, which is your attachment 1 and also this duplicate handout tonight, it's the same document. That would be the primary document that I would like you to focus on this evening. As the city manager mentioned, the current schedule has second reading, which you set at your August 11th second reading for December 5th. And in your staff report, there's an outline of the schedule and what would happen from this date on. So at this point, I'll turn this back over to you guys, and I'll let you have your dialogue and discussion on it further.
If we could, either Mr. Shields or Mr. Fuller, can you summarize your comments or
Sure.
the issues that you have?
Okay. The 6 issues were land use, and regarding the comprehensive plan and zoning amendments, as well as the related special exception. And the main objective that we see is to reduce the overall residential density and massing to improve the compatibility with the neighboring residential districts, particularly Park Avenue and the West Street. And with a redesign emphasis on scale and massing off of Park Avenue. And what we've listed is 5 strategies to get to that for the developer. Secondly, mobility, which is regard to the pedestrian, bicycle, parking, auto use, and the general traffic associated with that. And that's to improve the mobility of all modes by providing a traffic signal at North and West, Northwest Street and Park Avenue, crosswalks at the intersections of Northwest and Grove, possibly mid-block on West Broad. Thirdly, 20-foot sidewalks on Northwest. In terms of width, we see that as necessary for free and clear pedestrian use and the outdoor dining that's envisioned. Replace the proposed pork chop on Grove Avenue with an alternative traffic calming pedestrian bike-friendly design, and additionally provide strong traffic calming and parking management measures to minimize the impact on the residential streets on Grove, Park, West, and Lincoln. We have 17 strategies listed in that category. Thirdly, architecture, the massing, the community character, programmatic and spatial functionality, and to strengthen the visual and functional compatibility by reducing the building mass and height on Park Avenue, as well as North Street, as well as increasing the size of the public open space, both on the exterior and interior of the site, on Mason Lane. And the design should emphasize the transitional aspects of the project, such as building height, setbacks, step-backs, and buffers. And with that, we have 10 strategies listed. Fourthly, retail, to secure a major retail tenant or anchor, possibly a movie theater, and have viable parking plan that includes attractive and high-quality retail. With that, we have 7 strategies. The 5th item was environmental category, to integrate efficiency features and technologies in the project design to reduce energy consumption and overall carbon footprint of the development. Additionally, to balance the multiple objectives and expand on-site stormwater best management practices to mitigate adjacent off-site flooding issues in the vicinity. And we have 4 strategies listed there. And lastly, the voluntary concessions, community benefits, terms and conditions. The city is continuing discussions and negotiations with the applicants and finalizing their voluntary concessions and community benefits, potential impacts of the proposed project, community needs, the high-quality public and project improvements that we are looking to. These would include commitments to retail elements, to impact on community-based need as well, cash in-kind contributions, mobility components, which related to traffic, transportation, parking, vehicles, transit, bike, pedestrian, WO&D trail, and environmental, fire safety, public improvements, and so forth. We have 6 strategies listed for that. So in the context, we have these objectives and we have these strategies that are very refined. The other 2 documents that I referred to, the summary comments and the what I call the 100%, which is everybody's comment listed and categorized. Those are components of this. Those are the details that the developer can look to and say, okay, they're talking about this objective, and they can take those other 2 documents and see all the detailed comments and so really they're companion documents. So as we look for you to recommend guidance to the developer, while these objectives and these specific strategies are a tool for the developer, all the background information is there, and we really view these as all companion documents. So with that, that's my summary.
Thank you. And I presume these have been conveyed to the developer?
The developer has received a copy of these on Friday, and conversations with them. They have already initiated meetings this week with their team to start to go through them, and they were appreciative of the detailed information that they had received as well.
Thank you. Ms. Rogers, would you have any interest in coming up and letting us know what transpired at your Monday meeting? Thank you. Ruth Rogers, the Chair of our Planning Commission.
Well, we had our meeting on Monday, and because it was a public hearing, we were able to take comments from the citizens. We had a full house, and almost everyone spoke. So we had a lot of comments. I do have to say that Gary must have been working round the clock on these recommended actions and strategies and putting together all the comments, because we couldn't possibly have put all of that into our motion. So what we did was we continued the motion because we didn't feel as though there was anything that we could actually vote on. The proposal wasn't complete. There were a lot of things that the developer had said they were considering and might possibly put in, but because we didn't have that information, we didn't want to vote on anything as a recommendation to City Council. And we also did not want to include a summary of these recommended actions and strategies, because there were more things that came up during our hearing. And we wanted to, we didn't want to limit it to just a few things. So we're, we can't give you the guidance that you'd like, because we feel as though we're still reviewing the project. But we do support all of the things that are in this staff report. It's just that there are a few more that we'd like to look at and hope that when we get a work session and a more cohesive presentation from the developer, that we'll be able to come forward with our firm and final recommendations. So I hope you don't think we've let you down, but we didn't want to support something that wasn't finished.
And was there a consensus of the Planning Commission
There was a unanimous vote.
on the deferral? But
And
was
on
there-
the deferral and on this, I mean, some of our members had specific things they wanted to address, such as the condos, some parking, some other things, but because they weren't an option in the plans that we were looking at, while we spoke about them, and because they weren't presented to us, we didn't feel as though we could vote on it.
If I can just ask a quick question,
Yeah,
so we
sure.
are all on the same page. The plans that you're referring to, Ruth, are the plans from August 27th?
Yes,
I
there's,
think so.
there was a set
Yeah.
of two plans, the August
Right,
28th
it was the Mason
and
Row.
the July
Yeah.
7th
Which
combined
was what council voted on?
on the 11th of
On the
August.
referral out.
The plans that went out based on the August 11th referral were, that you had, were the July 7th. Later on the 28th of August, in response to a lot of the issues that were in August with this application, they submitted the Mason Row concept formally. Those were married together and then sent out to all boards and commissions for review. And then the Planning Commission also received those.
Okay,
It
so
had
it's
a work
roughly
session.
what we saw on the slides, but weren't in the actual
Right,
plans.
That is correct.
so we had a conceptual,
So it's similar to what we saw
yeah.
that night.
Very similar.
Thank you.
And when are we anticipating to receive revised materials? Is there a date that we've been told that we'll receive the staff? And
At this point, the latter part of October, prior to October 27th.
Okay.
And we continue this until the 17th
November
or the
17th.
20th? Okay, the 17th of November. So we have plenty of time between now and then to have another work session with the developer, which they have agreed to do.
That's true, although November 17th to December 8th is not a whole lot of time to address comments you might give at that point, so. I mean,
Well, we're hoping, we're hoping at some point we're going to see a final plan.
The current schedule right now outlined in your memo is for the developer to submit the revised plans the latter part of October. We've pre-scheduled a work session on November 3rd, tentatively. to have the developer present the plans to both a joint Planning Commission council meeting on the 3rd at a work session. The Planning Commission would like to have its own work session prior to that date if possible, or subsequent to that date. Then staff would be reviewing for several weeks, starting in the end of October through the early part of November, and then have staff comments available for the public hearing that the Planning Commission has continued until November 17th. So that's the schedule, and it is tight, but that's what we've got laid out at this point.
Well, I would just caution that if there's not enough time for proper review, so be it. But this project will not get rushed through. And December 8th is really when we take our break. So council is going to break December 8th until after the new year. So I don't anticipate any special meetings or anything else. So I would just make sure that everyone is aware that that is our schedule. And we need to have timely submissions to make sure there's adequate time to have them reviewed and commented on so that we can take action on December 8th.
I just want to absolutely agree with that point, and that's why I was going to chime in that, I understand that everybody's working very hard on these issues. Certainly, it sounds like staff is turning around their review and synthesizing a lot of the comments, et cetera, that are coming forward. So I commend them on that, and I know the developer has got lots of balls in the air and contracts, et cetera, and also trying to synthesize the comments and look at it from the various angles that they need to. So I appreciate that, but at the end of the day, I'm not going to place myself and the citizens of Falls Church in a situation where other people's deadlines, for whatever reason, are going to sort of jeopardize my ability to think about this and talk to our citizens in an informed way and engage in them. So I don't view there being a deadline right now. I know we have a second reading coming up, whenever that date is, and I'm not even focusing on that date. But to me, that's extremely soft at best. And if we get there in a reasoned way, great. And if we don't, I don't want to hear that contracts are gonna, fall through, et cetera, and we got to decide now. Just want to put that on the table that you're going to see one red face if I hear comments like that. So just want to put it out there for the developer and staff that we are, at least from my perspective, going to take our time to deliberate this with utmost speed. But if this drags out and we don't have a plan, we're not going to rush it through our process and have a gun to our head to make a decision because of other people's deadlines. So I just want to be clear on that point.
Ms. Rogers?
Mr. Mayor, I'd like to make just one other short comment. As I said, we had an open hearing and we had a lot of citizen comments. And I have to say that I've been on the Planning Commission for a while. These are some of the best thought out comments I have ever seen on a project. People have done a lot of research, and this is not just because it's my neighborhood comments. People from all over the city are commenting on this. So I think that we need to incorporate some of those things into what we're considering.
But, sorry.
So why don't we give Mr. Duncan and Mr. Baruch?
Following on that, I agree just from the email traffic that we're getting, and of course it's just a fraction of what you all are getting and what staff has plowed through. And in order to be respectful of that, I would just, as this one member, like to be able to, just send a quick email when somebody writes me about this so that they'll understand what the timetable and the process is, and what Gary went through, and what I think I hear you saying is, correct me if I'm wrong, we expect a resubmission in late October. We've scheduled a joint Planning Commission City Council work session for November 3rd. The Planning Commission itself may have a work session prior to that, maybe. Then the Planning Commission will again take, the serious bite on November 17th. And so anyone who has provided comments to us should watch for that late October submission to see if their concerns have been in any way addressed. I mean, I'm struck by some of the comments that I'm reading on email that refer to aspects of the plan that I think are no longer in the plan. But I agree with you, we don't know, and that's fine.
Yeah, that's the problem
You
with
know,
dealing
I
with
mean,
something that's not completed.
The good news is here, we've gotten everyone's attention, and I'm
I agree.
very serious about that. It is very good news. It's an important parcel. We do want to get it right, but I think it's part of getting it right is having a process that people understand, you know, when we receive comments, when we expect to get, you know, response from the applicant, and when we will dispose of those comments. So I think if we've accomplished only that tonight, that's significant. And I appreciate the staff's, you know, Herculean work plowing through all the information. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Z?
Thank you, Mayor. I agree that it's very difficult to have a set of cogent remarks and to react against a plan that we see has changed every 2 weeks and will change even more. I would observe that some of the changes have not always been for the best. This August 27th presentation it showed a garage access from Park Avenue, and that had never been seen before. And I just don't know how these things happen. Park Avenue people have been very clear that they wanted certain things, and at this point, we've met with them. Councilmember Duncan and I have met with them in the course of 2 weeks, past 2 weeks. Of course, the very fine folks at Grove Avenue as well, where a significant part of the 123 signatories to a petition showed up. So I think I've got a pretty good sense of maybe what they want, what they're looking for. But, you know, I got to tell you that just slipping in a parking garage entrance on Park is a deal breaker. These things just can't happen. Staff needs to catch these things and not come to us 2 weeks hence and say, oh, by the way, this is what it looks like now. So that's unacceptable. The other thing is that in addition to all the things that are before us tonight, and there's a lot to chew and to mull over, is that you know, environmental sustainability is not a concession. It's part of the way we do business now and going forward. Environmental sustainability is its own thing. It is not a concession. And further, to close this on this project, there may be other concessions that are going to be made, but I'm going to ask for a contribution, an annual contribution from this project in the order of $150,000 per year to fund a sustainability effort. These people are going to use the park, they're going to use their streets and other things, and this will allow the city to come back with an appropriate response in a way that, and do it on a continuing basis. So that needs to be part of the final package. And finally, maybe this is something we can get a comment on tonight, which is many of the concerns of people on Grove and Park have to do with traffic. And these are things that only the city can address through ordinance and regulation. So the next time we have a discussion about this, I want to see some progress on what your thinking is. You certainly have the comments. If you're unable to write some language, I'm happy to help you do that. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. Other comments about procedure or substance? Mr. Baruch?
So I think I had my 2 cents, and I'm glad that other council members are joining in as far as the process issues. So I don't want to belabor that as I did earlier. On the substance, sort of refreshed to see that staff has also essentially picked up on what I had proposed in the motion that I had put forward with the various points that needed to be addressed before we get to second reading, and it seems that they're consistent with what I had put forward that council unanimously passed, just with more granularity and scope. So I'm glad we're seeing that with a little bit more direction to the developer. And in some ways, I think at this point, it's really in the developer's court to kind of start looking at these and bring it forward. And Mr. Z, said this is changing, every 2 weeks. It is and it's not. I mean, we're sort of hearing that things are happening, but the problem is we're not seeing the plans evolving with the direction. I can understand why there's expenses to it, but I'm also not seeing any solid progress. But as Mr. Z points out, sort of little slippage. I didn't even recognize that parking issue, so thank you. Who knows what else that there is, but I'm not sort of seeing a checklist of here are the issues, here's how we're tackling them. And I think in the motion we had put forward to Mr. Shields, sort of update, so I check this as an update, but again, I'm not seeing tangible, concrete progress to those issues. Not saying that they're not being made, but there's got to be a way that we're messaging that or showing that. You know, if it's rough renderings that are being shown every 2 weeks, I'm happy to look at them, provide feedback, whatever it is. The problem is I'm not seeing that. But I just wanted to reiterate that I do support the staff comments. If that's sort of the question, as I understand it, Mr. Shields, is sort of what does council think about the staff comments? Is that sort of what the purpose is?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, at this point, we're still at the high-level negotiating framework with this project. That's where we are.
Well,
and so that's why the reams of comments need to be condensed down to a digestible set of points that the council can actually speak to in a reasonable meeting. And that was the staff effort to try to do that. And so the request is, are we aligned in those comments? Are there additional things that are key for the council? We need to know that. I think that's the key discussion.
Yeah, and I think as far as my perspective as one council member, I'm aligned with these comments as they've been put forward. I would probably also emphasize the voluntary concession piece, which I'm not, frankly, really interested in looking at in detail right now because I think the bones and overall structure is a little unclear to dive into the voluntary concessions. But I will say from what we've seen so far, and on a note that the manager sent to council members, I think we're far apart. That doesn't mean we can't close that gap, but as chair of the EDC, I don't think we're kind of at the point of diving into those at this point. I don't want to spend a lot of time without sort of really understanding what the project's financial scope looks like. And, you know, I'll be looking for staff thoughts on when we think the appropriate time to dive into detail on the true voluntary proffers. How about that, Mr. Z? But I don't think right now is the time is my sense, but I'm happy to get other council member feedback on that. But I do see that there is a wide gap from what we're seeing now. And again, I'm optimistic that we can close that gap.
Okay, other comments? Ms. Conley?
Mr. Fuller, one thing I think isn't in here, but I don't have a full set, so I can't review it, is the affordable housing comments. Are they in here? Okay, I only have part of the pages.
Yes, in terms of the affordable housing comments, there's they're listed in the documents, the attachment 2, and then summarized in attachment 3.
Are they
And
included
then
in attachment 1? That was my question.
Page 4,
Oh, I
right
didn't
under
get-
voluntary
I
concessions.
didn't get page
Okay.
4 for some
So if you
reason.
go with the handout, we had a duplicate copying problem,
I gave it to Mr. Tartar.
or a two-sided copying problem is what.
So it's on page 4F, voluntary concessions, the last of 6. It's the number 1 there. And then the entire comments are included in the other documents that were provided to you, which was attachment 5, which was the large package the planning commission got. So you got the raw documents there.
Other comments? Ms. Oliver?
I just want to echo what Mr. Duncan said, that I thought that the process on this project was excellent from the community engagement perspective and the boards and commissions. There was an awful lot of energy, enthusiasms, concerns. I think we got a lot of good input on it, and there is an awful lot to digest. And I know that in some cases people have talked about prioritizations, the things that are absolutely the killers. I know that for the neighbors, the parking garage exit on Park Avenue is a very, very critical concern. but I was pleased by the input that's been received, and I just look forward to getting something that we can evaluate against our criteria and take a look at the benefits for the city, of which there are many, and we don't know what the financial benefits are, but there certainly was enthusiasm for enhancing this particular plot.
Mr. Snyder?
Well, to summarize the comments from the council, I think the ball's in the developer's court. I think you've been given a extensive list. I think council members have made some additional comments. I think the planning commission had some additional things that they'll ask to be dealt with. Frankly, at this point, all I know about this project is that it's going to bring apartments and traffic, and neither one of which we really need. So I'll be interested to see how this project evolves. If I were called upon to vote on this project tonight, there's no question I'd vote no on it. So I think we've got a lot of work to do, and again, because it's very nebulous as to what it is, I think there's some opportunities here. I hope we can realize those opportunities. And I think a good way to begin is for the next iteration of this project to address successfully each and every one of these issues that are raised here. Thanks.
Thank you. Other comments? Any other comments? I would ask the city manager to give some thought to a parking plan. We've had discussions about this before. I think this is going to come up more and more as we have new projects that abut residential areas to make sure we can deal with parking in those areas and preserve the parking for the folks who live there already. And so I would encourage you, independently of this project, to give additional thought to how we might put together a plan to assure that the neighbors can preserve parking in their own streets. But I would echo the thoughts that I think the ball's in the developer's court. I'd hope you guys will make a new submission as soon as possible. And frankly, if you can knock away some issues along the way, I would encourage you to do so. In other words, not waiting to do it all in one fell swoop, but in fact, if you could say, hey, you know what, we've made this change. We haven't shown it to you graphically yet, but we've already decided we're going to do this, or make a commitment to this and that. I think you can help expedite the process and maybe alleviate some concerns of the community. So I would encourage you, as you're able to in an iterative process, let us know or staff know the changes you made along the way, and hopefully we can make some progress in this project. But anyway, thank you all for coming out tonight. I think that's about it for this one. We appreciate it, and we look forward to hearing back from you. Take care.
Sure.
People want to take a break, a 5-minute break. Is everybody okay? Everybody all right? No break? Okay. All right, the folks who are leaving, if you could head on out so we can go ahead and keep on talking, that would be great. Thank you for coming out. Miss Oliver, you're heading the wrong direction. All right. All right. I wasn't talking about you leaving. So, all right, so why don't we, Mr. Shields, go on with the next item. As I guess as a preface for the people in the public, I think the idea was we were talking about the water sale proceeds initially as our main item, and we'll be taking action on that in the near future. But in connection with that discussion, there would also be a discussion about Mount Daniel and the financing for Mount Daniel, but that would be sort of secondary or come after the discussion about the water sale proceeds. Is that right, Mr. Shields?
That is correct, and there's one additional item that we would ask that we have the council's attention to first, which is the carry forwards ordinance. So what we have are two requested budget ordinances, and the first is, as is typically the case at this time of year, we come to council with underspending from the prior fiscal year and a request to carry that money forward so we can complete projects, or in some cases, redesignate funds that were unspent in the prior fiscal year to needs that have been identified since then. That ordinance, we'll go through what those items are, but I do want to just be very clear from the beginning that this is strictly deploying underspending from the prior fiscal year. It's not using any revenue surplus. That's all been used for other purposes that council's already designated, i.e. To help with FY15 budget and for capital reserves. And so we'll go through a description of those. I'll ask Mr. LeCondre to do that, and then from there get council comments on those. And then from there, go to the water proceeds budget amendment, which is predicated on the carry forwards budget going on its track, and then the water proceeds ordinance would be a separate and a second action by the city council on Tuesday night next for first reading, and then second reading at the end of October. So, Ms. LeContre, if you could give us a briefing on what those items are in the carry forward requests, and we'll answer questions on those first.
Before we get to that, if I could, I neglected to mention a petition against Mason Road that was received at a few minutes ago before we started discussion. But there are 260 signatories. I believe it's probably from the owner of the Sunoco, but I just wanted to mention that to the public and the members on council. I can pass this around if anyone has any interest in that, but I neglected to mention it during our discussion. Mr. LeCondre, my apologies. Please continue.
Not a problem. Happy Wednesday, Council. All right, I will go through this as quickly as possible. The general fund increase as a result of this ordinance will be $1.6 million. The breakdown is as follows. You have grants and contributions totaling $159,800. 28.4 is a staff request to appropriate unspent community block grant funds from the prior year. You have 2 requests for seized assets that can only be used for our police department. One is for protective gear for the officers. The other is for purchase of light equipment for the Operations Command Van and for bulletproof glass for the records office and for additional training for police officers. The other item is $29,000 for the library. Each year the library receives donations and has book sale proceeds that they come to you at this time of the year to ask to appropriate so they can buy the necessary books and electronic resources for the library. The next part is a little more extensive. What we've tried to do is outline for you those items that are carry forwards. And we do have items that are not. I will go through them all. You have $25,000 for the Catch Foundation program. The city currently has $20,000 in local funds, and we have a request letter from Catch that's attached. There's $117,000 in carry forwards for information technology expenditures. There's $30,250. It's a carry forward for the additional library space study that council has discussed already. There is $15,000 for a library parking study. $130,000 is a carry forward for rewiring the traffic signal at Broad Street in Washington. $15,000 for office renovations to accommodate additional CIP project management staff in Public Works. $20,000 for repainting the community center. $125,000 is a carry forward to transfer to the Capital Improvement Fund for West End Park construction and for contingency. And the reason for this is the lowest bid came in higher than what was budgeted. There's $100,000 for a transportation planner. There's $150,000 for replacement of sheriff's vehicles, $150,000 for 2 dump trucks for Public Works. Several of the trucks are over 20 years old. There's $159,000 to cash fund 3 replacement police vehicles rather than debt finance them. We also have $597,000 that's committed to future development costs. As you recall, what we're doing is taking excess fees that were received in the last 2 fiscal years, actually, and we are putting them in the fund so that we can cover inspection costs in the future as these projects progress. We also have 200,000.
We can pause for questions on
Yeah.
these items, because this has been the list, the carry forwards and this, the building permit fees are, we're happy to take any comments or questions on those.
Mr. Burke?
Yeah, mine is perhaps a little bit more fundamental question. I'd like to just kind of take a step back and kind of get a better understanding of, on the carry forwards, these are essentially new items. Am I understanding that correctly? That would be coming on? Based on underspending that happened in other areas?
Some of it, yes.
Okay, so
Well,
let's talk about.
A carry forward is a project that was budgeted for in FY14, specific to do a specific
so-
thing, and it didn't get done, and so we
Right.
carry it forward. Some of the items are actually new items.
Okay, so can we somehow highlight those in the discussion? Because
So
the carry
everything that
forwards,
says carry forward is a carry forward, everything that doesn't say carry forward is
It's
a new
not.
item.
that's helpful. And here's the point that I'm trying to make, because obviously for the carry forwards that are old, there was, a process that was thought through. They just weren't done in a particular time frame. So I get that. On the new, what I'm trying to understand is how we came about the need, and were they priorities that we just didn't have the money for when we did our budget process, which often happens, or is it something new that's coming up that's requiring attention to that item? And if it's none of those things, why isn't it just waiting, the money going into the general fund and then going into the, sausage making fest that will happen over the budget? Why are they in line ahead of everything else that's going to come up? So if we can think about it that way, I know it would help me, rather than sort of this level of, deep dive line by line, which
Well, in our
don't
budget
find helpful.
presentation, we always have the list of the unmet needs. In the budget, here's what we're funding, and here are the things that we'd like to fund but we can't fund. And so the things that are on here that are new are off of that unmet needs list, and we've gone through a prioritization
Okay.
thought process.
So let me just make sure I understand it again, because that's what I'm trying to drive home at. So all the items that are new, that are not carry forwards, were on that list of unmet needs.
Or have popped up. And here's an example of the parking study for the library, for example. To pursue the idea with our neighboring property owner to have a structured parking lot to serve the library and to serve City Hall, potentially serve the whole downtown area, we need to have a concept that will tie into the architecture of the library. And so we've asked for some funding to help develop that concept plan so we can proceed with
Okay,
those
so
discussions with the
I
contractor.
hate
So
to go out on a limb
that's
here,
a little bit
but
new, just as an
I think we
example.
need to restructure this discussion a little bit, because I'm frankly, I think it might be helpful just for the council to focus in on the carry forwards, see if there's any items that we think are not worth doing anymore, rather than carrying them through. On the new items, figuring out, which ones were priorities, and are they still priorities, and if they're new, why they're new and why they're popping up, rather than just going down the list, because I'm just getting lost without any context of where we're at and where we've been. Is that? Sorry, I just needed to hit reset.
So other comments? I don't know if you had the comment, Ms. Conley, and Mr. Z does. Did you have a comment you wanted to make?
No, I appreciate Mr. Burke bringing that up because I was having the same level of confusion.
Did you have a comment on, as to that? Or whether you agree with what he's
I
proposed?
agree with what Mr. Burke just proposed.
Mr. Z?
Yes, I'm happy for, that one of our council members putting on his fine analytic hat is asking for several things I think fundamental for this discussion. It's an unmet need to carry forward. In my previous life, we always had 25% unmet needs, and lo and behold, money would come along and we would meet those unmet needs. That's just a way of budgeting that not always appropriate in a local government, because our constituents want to know if it's an unmet need, it needs to be revalidated. Could there be another way of meeting that need? It's not just blindly because we have the money, let's go and spend it. So we have to say that it makes me unhappy that we have all these things mixed together. And I wasn't even going to get into my favorite topic, which is West End Park. So just to maybe I heard something in the past that is no longer true, or maybe I misheard it, but I understand there was $650K that we bonded and we've been paying on that bond for almost a year for West End Park, and now you're saying that 528 is more than you had expected to spend. We need to put another 125 in there. It's just that kind of strange math that I just don't get.
Well, West End Park, remember, it was put in the CIP, I think 7 years ago, as a $400,000 project. And let me finish. And so, as part of the capital improvements program, that was designated to be debt financed. We did go to market, and it was part of a package of debt for a whole host of things. And so there's $400,000 that is designated for West End Park from last December's bond issuance. And so we need additional funds to cover the cost of the park based on the bids that we've received.
Well, that creates a whole set of questions in my mind that maybe now's not the time to ask for it, but I think we owe it to our citizens here that when they ask, what are you bonding, what have you bonded, in what amount did you bond, that we have a good answer for that. And so I'm looking for a simple construct that says, these are when we issue the bonds, these are the terms, this is what we bonded for. And so, you know, when I heard that it was in the budget for 650 in the CIP, and you had already bonded, you know, maybe some other person could make the same mistake I made, which is that, you know, if you're saying it's worth 650, you'll bond it for that amount, instead of bonding it for a smaller amount. And we've been paying debt service on it now for quite a while, and then coming back to us and say, oh, by the way, we have additional money, we need to put that into this project. And I think that's just not the way I do business. It doesn't really make sense to me, or I think a lot of the people that live in the city. So I want that list of what we're bonding, what the terms are, what the period is, and the things that if we're taking off the books, like you're proposing now to cash fund 3 replacement police vehicles, there's got to be a savings here somewhere. It's got to be some impact, not just a long list of things that say, okay, we have $1 million, let's spend it. That just doesn't make sense to me or to some of my colleagues
I can
here.
assure you that that was not the approach that was taken.
Well, that's the impression that's left here,
Well,
Mr. City Manager.
I'm sorry that impression is taken, but
You're
that's,
creating that impression.
well, these are all lists that are here before the council for your consideration, and they are unmet needs. There are additional funds that are going to capital reserves from underspending and from surplus revenues. It was not, we have a pool of money, let's go out and spend it. These are identified needs that we're bringing a proposal for
Previously
council to.
identified these. You know, we've asked for a way of treating this already, so this is not a good time to say, well, you looked at this before, you looked at this a year ago, it should be okay now. Yeah, I'm telling you, it's not okay. So I've asked for specific things to be done to allay our concerns, and I think that, you know, if we can understand it clearly and simply, and the taxpayers can do that, then I think all of our jobs are going to be that much easier. Thank you, Mayor.
So is there a consensus of the group maybe to break these out as to carry over items or carry forward items as a distinct group, and then new spending items or items that are not carry forward as a separate distinct?
Just since I had it on the screen, if it's highlighted, it was labeled as a carryover, so I highlighted it to ease your viewing.
I got you, but I know we can see through the list, but I think there's some concern that I've heard expressed that we're taking care of this or looking at this one fell swoop, as opposed to, you know, the things that are carried forward are items that have been considered previously. The items that are not are new items that probably haven't had the same level of consideration or scrutiny.
That's right.
And I don't know whether that is something the council would like to break those two up, but Ms. Oliver had a comment. I'd like to hear her.
I just think that there's 3 categories. There's carry forward, there's new items that we're trying to fund now that were on the previous unfunded needs list, and then there are the new items that have come up since then, and those are 3 separate categories.
Is there a desire to consider those 3 categories separately? In other words, not in one group as they're presented here today?
I think so, and the level of scrutiny on each of those changes, but I think part of that mix is going to be, to Mr. Z's point, which I share, is just because it's a carry forward that we talked about before, and I'm not suggesting that staff is doing it in a different way, but it has more to do with how it's being laid out before the council, just revisiting and revalidating whether that's neat or not, and putting it in the mix, because we know we have other pressures coming up. And this just seems very divorced than what we're going to be doing upcoming. So there may be items that I may view as still being critical, or there may be views, even though they're carry forwards, that are critical that we need to do now, or there may be items that we say, you know, this needs to go in the sausage making process that's going to happen a few months from now. So that's how I'm viewing how this is going to need to go, because these are not, I mean, we're talking about, what do we say, overall 1.6 mil?
Okay, so is there then a consensus, it sounds like, to have these considered as 3 separate boxes or categories of spending that we need to analyze in further detail? I see one head nodding. I don't see any others nodding. 2 nods, 3 nods. Mr. Snyder, you
Yes,
nodding?
Mayor,
I
it's
just
got to
wanna
make
clarify
sense
for the
to us,
record.
it's got to make sense to the taxpayers. I don't want to beat someone as far as marketing said, did you buy some new sheriff's vehicles? And say, yeah, I did. And said, was that something that we knew about? And I've got to be able to give them an answer that makes sense to them and to me. Not just because we had some money and decided to spend it.
And,
I'm sure you could do a great job of the justification. That's all we're asking for.
And there's one other sort of something that needs to also get highlighted in the staff report that I was also going to raise. Some of these items may have carrying costs as we move forward. I just note, for example, the transportation planner shows up as 100K item, but that's an ongoing, so we got to somehow footnote that, just so we, I mean, it's obvious, but given the list of items that we're going to be generating, some of it may be unclear. For example, new vehicles have costs. We just need to get a sense of that it's an ongoing cost and how much that is. And that may not be clear just from reading the item.
Okay, so Ms. Connolly had a question. Let's wrap this portion of our discussion up.
My question just is about the source of some of these funds. It says carry forwards and use of unassigned fund balance. So numbers 10, 11, and 12. I know we had talked about setting up the capital reserve fund that was going to take unspent monies and put it towards vehicles. Is that what this is?
No,
No,
no. We have not set up
we haven't set that up.
a vehicle reserve fund, and that's why we're doing this. The dump trucks initially, just for example, for Public Works, were part of an unmet need, and we were going to address them. When we were thinking about coming forward to address them, the issue for the rewiring of Broad and Washington Street came up, so there was no longer money available for the dump trucks. Okay? The sheriff's vehicles have been an unmet need, and we tried to address them with this budget amendment. The police vehicles, we had intended to bond fund, but since we have the cash, we chose to do that, which would save you financing costs. But as Mr. Z has pointed out, we can break this down for you by category and provide the justification for it. Some of these items that are new are council initiatives. It's not something that we sat down and made up.
Okay, thank you. Why don't we go ahead and, do you have anything more, Ms. Connolly?
So I'm just wondering where the extra money came from to pay for these
It's
things.
the underspending.
It's all underspending of
all
the city
underspending.
budget. That's where
Right.
all that, okay.
Okay,
Right,
so
the-
why don't,
The only category it can go in when it's underspending is unassigned fund balance. Okay, so that's why you have this title.
And then that's technically what it is all right now is unassigned fund balance. And so if it's not used, it could either go for capital reserves or just stay in unassigned fund balance. Those are, that's where it will go if no action is taken.
okay, so why don't we wrap this discussion up, and are we ready to proceed? Why don't we go ahead and proceed to the next portion of this, Mr. Shields?
One process question.
Quickly.
It sounds like council is going to want to see something fairly, a a pretty major revision of how the information is presented. Are we still going to go forward on Monday?
I think so. I don't think we can without receiving more information. Do others feel differently?
I just wanted to understand. So we are not going to take this up on Monday, Tuesday?
Well,
It seems to me that's
that's
the
a
what's
discussion
it-
we need to have, so yeah.
I mean, do people want to go ahead? I would imagine people would want to consider whatever information is brought forth without having to act on it the same night it comes forward, but others may feel differently.
I mean, again, we haven't gone through. Again, we haven't gone through the list, and this sort of gets to my sort of context. I mean, I feel like I'm sort of responsible for throwing a monkey wrench in where staff was going on this, but I just think context, especially when we're in these difficult financial straits, whenever we're doing discussions with council, there just has to be this context. And I think just diving in sort of with the sharp pencils isn't, that's important to dive into the weeds, but we got to start with what's the bottom up? What are we trying to get at, and what's the context of all this? Because as Mr. Z mentioned, I mean, our taxpayers aren't going to remember what happened at the beginning of the tax season in the fiscal year when we put the budget together and where these priorities are coming from. So having that context and setting that vessel for the discussion is just critical, rather than diving into the items without any context. But with that said, as far as what may need to get done Monday, I mean, I'm certainly open if there's critical items that are absolute necessity for public safety issues, et cetera. I don't want to sort of not listen to what staff has to say if there's sort of emergency items on this list. So if there are, I mean, let us know if there's something that must be acted upon, if it fits within the category of safety concerns.
And I would just note, this is a work session, and so the only time and place we can have this discussion is here at work session, and we're bringing these needs to you with a potential way to fund them, but we get it. We need more context and a larger description for each of these items.
I just think it's been very difficult to take action on Monday, given the questions that have been raised tonight. And I would suggest, unless there's something that's a critical need, that we go ahead and put this on for the next work session, try to work through it with the idea of acting shortly thereafter.
If I could just comment, I mean, I don't know if we don't take this up until the 20th and 27th, and then second reading is in November, how does that impact the CIP process? And I'm aware of that because I was at the library board meeting, and they were talking to the consultant about the library space study, and they were interested in learning more about whether or not we were going to do the parking study, because this impacts what they're going to request in the CIP process, which, Cindy, what's the deadline on that?
Staff is starting to develop the CIP now, and we are expecting the consultants to deliver the report in November so that staff can finish November, December, the staff work, present to the Planning Commission in January. So from that perspective, we'll get tight, but we continue to work with the consultants.
Okay, does that plan of action sound workable to you all?
Well, there are others, there's some grants and things in here that are time sensitive.
Maybe you could present those to us on Monday, to the extent that there's any action that needs to be taken, or we'll lose funding, or there'll be safety issues, et cetera. Bring those to us on Monday.
Is it too much trouble to just go through these line by line and tell me the ones you don't want in there because you want more information? That way the other things can go forward.
I just think, given
That's why
what
we're
else
having the work session.
I hear you, although we've got a lot more on the work session than this, and I think probably bigger fish to fry in some ways. We've got a water sale proceeds that really need to have some action that I think we need to finish up or work through. And so, some of these items, $15,000 for this and that, I'd hate to get bogged down with a couple-hour conversation about some of these items, and I could see that happening.
Well, it would just be a yes or no.
Well, I don't think we can make a yes or no unless we know, for example, the sheriff's cars. How old are the current sheriff's cars? What are we buying? There's a lot of questions of something as simple as
Well,
buying a
then
car.
that would be a no until you got more clarification.
Well, I guess people may feel differently. If there's a desire to go through these line by line right now, I'm certainly willing to do that. But I suspect that this is probably not the time or the place, maybe the place, but not the time for it.
I guess I would just add that without putting this stuff in context, going through it line by line is very difficult. I believe that there are some items that we may need to act on Monday, And I would rely on staff to narrow that list down as small as possible and to make sure that the material that we receive on Monday is as clear as possible and that it come out as far in advance as possible so we can ask, or Tuesday, so we can ask questions. But I mean, if there is anything that needs to come forward, it should come forward. And I'm aware of time pressures on some of the planning stuff, but
All right, well, I think you've got your answer on that as to how we want to proceed. I understand respectfully what you've suggested, but I think we're going to go forward, as we mentioned earlier. Why don't we go on to the next element of this, if we can, Mr. Shields?
And by that, you mean the other changes, the WMATA changes, the capital project changes?
Yes.
Just a quick run through of those. Richard, could you do
Okay.
that, and then we'll...
All right. We have a $200,000 WMATA obligation. It's currently in the general fund budget. What we're proposing is to move it to the Special Transportation Fund. What that does is it increases our CNI equivalent. It'll go from 800 up to $1 million. If you do the calculation for CNI, it's 950,000. And that would be the amount of money that we would be able to access. So all this does is it moves it to a different fund so that we can access more of the state money.
And has that been clear? Do we feel comfortable, Mr. Snyder? Any comment on that? Do we feel comfortable that that's not an issue?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, we need to move on this because otherwise we lose, what, $150,000. So,
It wasn't so much about that, but the actual use of putting it in this category. Is that an issue?
I think we should because we can use it to leverage. It's not new money. This is really a bookkeeping transaction from one fund to another. By putting it into this other fund, it gives us the ability to then get an additional $150,000 of the NVTA money that, after all, our taxpayers have paid for.
But so the WMATA does qualify for that?
Yes, we've
Yes.
verified it's an
That-
eligible
we
activity.
know that for
based-
sure.
Yes, based on
Okay,
the
that-
Council of Councils MBTA
That was my question. All right, thank you.
So is there any, I mean, this seems sort of no-brainer. Is there any drawback of moving the money from one fund to another?
No.
All right, well, that sounds good. Let's move on to the next portion of this.
All right, we have a couple of changes within the capital improvement fund. We'll skip the 125 because that's related to another carry forward item. We have transfers between projects for $152,000 from the Community Center HVAC project to the facilities reinvestment. The funds will be to repair and remove asbestos from the community center roof. And the estimated cost is $125,000.
You're already doing that right now, though. I mean, I can see it out. I mean, look outside, and there it is. It's already happening.
All right, if you go down to item B, you have $289,000 for the closed loop project. We're moving that to the Roosevelt Sidewalk project, and that's because the grant is administered by VDOT, and it was originally planned to use to install video cameras at several traffic lights, but given the staff levels and the need, the maintenance budget and operational cost-benefit analysis, the staff will not be moving ahead with this project. So we want to put that in the Roosevelt Sidewalk project, which has public safety and accessibility issues that we can resolve by making that transfer.
what was the closed loop project?
That's a system to allow us to, from City Hall, change signal timing. And so there are some intersections that we will still do.
There was two phases to the closed loop CIP project. One is the one Mr. Shields is speaking to, where we put radios on all of them, and we can now remotely control the traffic signals ourselves if they get out of control, and that piece is finished. This was to look at TV cameras so that we could visually see them. The technology is changing, and so there's some question of whether we're getting a good cost benefit from it, but it also has more maintenance and operational costs from it. So Public Works and Prioritization is working to shift that state money to the Roosevelt and Roosevelt project where we needed additional money to increase the sidewalk width and accessibility. So we still have the closed loop phase 1 done where we can control all of our traffic signals remotely by public works staff, which saves money because we were having a consultant out of Baltimore do it.
All right, the next item, B, is 132,660,000, and it's going from the bus stop improvement project to the Roosevelt intersection project. Reason for this is we have other state grants that we can use for the bus stop project.
And that other state grant money is 70% MVTA.
We have 118,000 or 119,000 from the Broad Street Streetscape project that we're moving to the Bridges program. These are local funds originally intended to improve the streetscape in the village section of Broad Street. It's going to cost more than the 119,000, so we're reprogramming it to the Bridges program to address safety issues. We have other changes in the
I'd like some more background on that. You don't need to do it tonight, but before we vote on that, I'd like some more background there.
We can provide that.
Other
Mr. Z?
changes.
I'm sorry, Mr. Z may have had a comment as well.
Yes, thank you. Before we leave the issue of transportation improvements, are there any funds in here to fix the light standard that's been down at the intersection of Park and Pennsylvania? I mean, it's been down so long that someone has put a little sign on the orange barrel that says it's going to be all right eventually. So I see I'm not the only person that's seen that sign.
That should be in the operating budget, but we'll have to.
Yeah,
check
that's an
with
operating
Public
budget item.
Works.
That's not it shouldn't be a capital item.
Soon, right?
Soon, yeah, let me find out what the status of that
Right,
is.
thank you.
Please continue.
All right, the other CIP changes include $1,055,000 of projects, but only if grants were approved. We did get approval for $100,000, and we got $255,000 in state grant for bus shelters, and that was approved for $239,700. The local portion is required is $465,000. And that will come out of 200 from the 70% transportation and 250 from the 30% transportation. Staff has received 18,500 of bus shelter voluntary concessions from developers to complete this project. And that's it.
And all of those projects were in the CIP. All we're doing is changing the funding sources, not changing the projects in your adopted CIP.
So, Mr. Snyder, did you ask about C above 2C? Was that what you were asking about? Further information? Okay, yeah, I would like to know that as well. Not just what the new project is, but why the reason for the old?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, why don't we move on?
Second budget amendment is for the disposition of the water sale proceeds. And to summarize, the net proceeds from the sale of the water system are approximately $20.5 million. And so the budget amendment that is before the council would allocate $10 million of that to be invested to earn the taxpayers a perpetual return on investment on principal through investment in the city pension fund. And $10.5 million would be allocated to capital reserves, which will be applied towards specific city facility and infrastructure projects through the CIP through later action by the city council. And so this lays out just the key thing here is how much is going to capital reserves and how much is going to receive to earn the longer term return on investment of principal through the pension fund.
Could I ask you, just in a pause, the second category, that includes both long-term capital projects and also the short-term that we discussed as well. Those are both stuck together basically in one
Yes.
box? Okay.
It
thank you.
does, and so that, and we can certainly discuss this, but this is predicated on the idea that then through the capital improvements program, we'll make finer distinctions as to how the funds would be allocated towards the major capital projects and how much would be allocated towards immediate projects in the city.
Did you have more presentation, or was that pretty much it? I know we've heard this before.
That's pretty much it.
This is pretty much the action for it. I would just note that we got a note from the city's actuary today, and we've been pressing them, ahead of their normal schedule to provide us with the actuarial unfunded liability in the pension fund. And they've indicated to us that on an actuarial basis, they anticipate that their 2014 number will be $9.2 million as the actuarial unfunded liability. And that has been a guiding principle throughout this discussion, that's a rational nexus in terms of an investment strategy in the pension fund. If the city were to put in $10 million, there would be no penalty for that. We would put the $10 million in, as we've discussed, and receive a return on investment for that. But I just wanted to note that, since that has been our nexus and sort of the rationale behind doing that really from the beginning of the discussion. And so when we take council direction on that, we could change this number to 9.2 million based on what that initial that number is from our actuaries, or keep it at 10, or a different number from council direction.
I'm going to open this up to questions and comments in just a second. Let me just ask a precatory question. Have we determined through your prior dealings with council that it would be legally permissible to fund $10 million, even though the unfunded balance was actually $9.2 million?
Yes. That question gets to the fundamental issue of funding future obligations. And so we believe that the memos that the council has received under the Dillon rule, there's really no state regulation of this other than the implicit obligation of the city to fund its pension obligations, and that is in state law.
Thank you. Comments, questions? I know we've had prior discussion on numerous occasions. We do have a town hall that I would remind both members of the council and members of the public this Saturday at 10 a.m., Mr. Shields, in the community center. Is that correct?
It's going to be in council chambers, actually.
My apologies, council chambers. So public is invited to that, and we'll have further discussion and the ability to get comments from the public at that time, not tonight, but at that time you're welcome to speak. And we have first reading up in council chambers. You're welcome to speak then as well, if you would like. And so I think whatever we may say tonight is predicated on hearing more input from the public. But do we have comments or questions right now from anyone on council as to Mr. Shields' proposal? Mr. Z?
I do have a question, and the first one is was that number 9.2 million?
Yes.
Good. What is our ability currently to bond, and at what rate? So how much ceiling do we have left currently, and what would our rate be if we put something on the market, say, tomorrow?
Well, our ceiling, in terms of how much we can afford, is a different question from how much statutorily we're able to issue. So I think, let me get back with you on those numbers, because they're actually
They're very different.
They are very different, but
Not meant to be a trick question.
the other question does tie into the next discussion, which is what are rates right now, and currently they are between 3 and 3.5%. If we were to issue for Mount Daniel, for instance, which we're planning to do, if the voters approve that, we're anticipating that the rate will be between 3 and 3.5%.
Mr. Shields, if I could ask a question, I know others have some, and I'll yield to them in just a moment. What is the savings on an operating basis, or anticipated or estimated savings on an operating basis for a contribution, let's say, of $9.2 million? Does the city staff have, you run the numbers, I presume, and I could probably do it in my head.
Yeah.
What is that number for annual savings, so to speak?
Well, it would be the anticipated average long-term yield
Yes.
for that investment would be 7%. So 9.2 million times 0.07, and
Well, we use $10 million. It's 700, slightly less than 700,000.
Why don't we use the right number? If it turns that's the number we're going to do, at least we can have correct numbers. And I know it's a little less, but maybe it'd be good just to get the actual number we're anticipating.
let me give that to you in like 30 seconds.
Okay, that's fine.
Is there another question?
Well, that number is being crunched by our supercomputer. Why don't we go ahead and open it up to other questions? Mr. Duncan, sounds like you might have a comment or
Thank you,
question.
Mr. Mayor. Just one. So, Richard, as I understand it, the $9.2 million figure.
644,000.
There you
Thank
go.
you.
We don't need a computer.
Wow. See? I didn't even get started. That's impressive. The $9.2
I
million figure would 100% fund our pension obligations. Is that correct?
That's right.
So if we put 10 million in, we would technically be overfunding our pension obligations, and you don't have to go into detail on this tonight, but I think it'd be helpful for Saturday's meeting for the public to understand how that, quote, overfunding, if we did that, would be handled. And my understanding is that it would help cushion down performance years in the market. Right now, the market's doing great. It will not always do great. And just think, if we're going to take that option, if we're even going to consider that option, it would be helpful for people to understand, where that money goes. Because if you put 10 million in, you do earn about 710,000, obviously. So the difference between 644 and 710 is not a lot, but everything's something. So just maybe have that as one of your points of focus on Saturday.
Okay.
Other comments, questions? Please, Mr. Snyder.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. One of the issues that I've raised before is the legality of this, and in view of us having a new city attorney, I would like a written memo to make sure that she's not aware of any potential challenges to this, as the actuaries who made a very convincing financial presentation admitted this has never been done before in Virginia. So I don't want to do something that locks up the money just to find out that we can't get the returns, or that we can be challenged down the road for doing what we're doing. Thank you.
Okay, other comments? Ms. Oliver?
On the second page, lines 43 to 46, we talk about the commitment to the capital reserve, and you sort of define what the capital reserve is and what it's spent on and what our benefits are from that. I would be interested in possibly making a further commitment to the funds, that we be very, very clear that we want to make sure that the money that we spend this on is clearly a long-term benefit, not a 5-year benefit or a 10-year benefit, but something that is going to be beneficial to the city in the long term. I have a specific interest in trying to make sure that we look for capital projects that could potentially help the city generate future revenues, but any need that's clearly long-term, and I don't have precise language, but I would like something put in there to indicate that we want to make sure that the way we spend this money, and I understand, Mr. Shields, that your proposal is that we discuss this through the CIP process, but this particular pot of money, or this, the funds that we're putting in there, I want to make sure that they're very clearly designated for future revenue growth, if at all possible.
I mean, one thing I might say is that we have had discussion that some of these would be for short-term, almost kind of fix-it-up sort of things, which I'm not sure would qualify as long-term. For example, if it's repainting areas or, cleaning up the downtown, I'm not sure that quote is a long-term capital improvement. Are you saying you're not in favor of those kind of short-term fixes?
I guess I don't know the precise wording. I mean, what I'm interested in doing is, this is money that we would not normally have in the course of things. So I don't want to use it on ordinary capital projects unless that's really the best use and there's no other use identified. But I'd like to look for projects that would lead, for example, to future economic development in the city. And if something as simple as sprucing up the downtown could make a contribution towards making the city a more attractive place for other people to invest or for new businesses to open, I think that would qualify. But I'm sort of looking, I myself am just interested in making sure that this is used in a way to maximize any future revenue growth that we might get out of the investments that we make with it.
Okay. Why don't we try to reach closure on this? I know we're not voting on anything tonight. We have some public input that's going to come over the following days or weeks. But I believe, having heard comments tonight and in prior meetings, that there is a consensus to moving in the direction of paying off the pension fund. In other words, fully funding the pension, whether that's $9.2 or $10 million, and using another pot of money for long-term capital, with the idea that we may also use money, in which I would favor, on shorter-term projects to maybe spruce up our downtown, create some economic development with. And, I mean, unless there are other comments, maybe we could just leave it at that, with the idea that we're all going to be listening to what people have to say over the coming days, over the weekend, at the town hall, et cetera. But why don't we go ahead, unless there's someone else has something they need to say right now, wrap that discussion up and move on to discussion about Mount Daniel. Is that okay with folks? Okay, and before we start on discussing Mount Daniel, if I could just make a couple points. One is, I want to make sure the public understands there are some limitations of what council can do, both as a body and as individual elected officials, with respect to supporting a referendum or opposing a referendum. There are limitations in state law, and so that may explain to some degree why people have not been more vocal as to this referendum who are sitting around this table. And so you should keep that in mind. Also, there are a number of variables with respect to our final budget and what the tax rate will be next year that we don't know right now. So 98% of the budget is not Mount Daniel, it's all the other things. So there are assessments that we don't know. We're not going to know until January. There are business license taxes, meals taxes, operating budgets, and all sorts of variables that we don't know. So keep that in mind, and as you hear our discussion tonight, that this is a portion of what next year's budget will be and what the tax rate ultimately will be, but it is not the entirety. It's a portion of it. With that, maybe I'll turn it over to Mr. Shields, and you can give us some discussion or lead the discussion about Mount Daniel.
I've passed out a document here, and there's some extra ones on the table there. A couple of things I would just note about options for financing Mount Daniel school expansion. One, the project cost is $15.6 million. That's almost exactly half the size of our last major capital project, which was the Mary Ellen Henderson Middle School. And we're going into this project due to the decisions made by this city council and prior city councils in stronger financial shape than we've ever been going into a major capital project, in which we have options on how we would pay for it. Through the decisions by the council, we have accumulated $4.2 million of developer proffers that can be used for school capital costs, and that's very helpful. We have the water sale proceeds that can be used for major capital projects such as this. That's obviously also very helpful. So while that's very good news, and we're in a stronger position financially to do the project than we have ever been at this point on the verge of a project before, we also have to be mindful of the fact that we have very large capital needs out there. We've identified $132 million worth of capital needs in the city. Over 90% of those are for school projects. And the largest one, $100 million, and we're looking through a lot of creative ways to finance these. But so that strength that we have, the water sale proceeds, the developer proffers, they're helpful, but by no means do they solve our financing needs. So what the council has authorized is a bond referendum that will be on November 4th, and authorization of up to the full project cost be funded by debt. We've already issued $1 million of debt for this project. We did that in 2013. So our base case would be for the remaining $14.6 million. At the bottom of page 1, the base case will have an annual debt service with a range between $1.38 million and $869,000, depending on how that debt is structured. If we went with a 20-year bond at level principal, in other words, you take your principal amount, you divide it by 20, you're going to pay that principal amount every year, and then your interest costs tail down. That is a very effective way to finance debt. But it does have the largest cost right up front, but then that cost decreases over the 20-year period. Level debt service is how most people do their home mortgage, where you have the same monthly payment that will last the whole life of the mortgage. What that means is you pay very little principal in the beginning, pay a lot of interest, and then over time your interest payments get smaller, your principal payments get larger, but the amount that you're paying on a regular basis remains the same. And so I've highlighted that one. That's the one at $1.1 million, $1.137 million is what we would estimate if we went to market in December, the annual debt service for a 20-year bond will be. We also ran some options for 30 years, again at level principal and at level debt. So the tax rate equivalent for that, just taking that base case scenario, would be between 2.4 cents on the tax rate to 3.9 cents on the tax rate in year one. And if you went with the 1.1 million, that's about 3 cents on the tax rate. And that's what we have been discussing with the school superintendent, and just in terms of the basic forecast. So other options, again, if you consider the context of a very large capital program, and so any decisions on the use of water sale proceeds or proffers ought to be made in that larger context. But if you take a case where we issue the same $14.6 million in debt, but we've invested $10 million in the pension fund and assigned the full anticipated annual required contribution, ARC savings, and we assign those savings to debt service, then that's case one. So you have your $1.1 million of annual debt service costs minus your savings in pension costs for a net cost of $400,000. That's a tax rate equivalent of 1.1 cents. Case two takes the same premise as case one, but we buy down the amount of debt issuance by using cash from proffers and from the water sale proceeds. For the proffers, we have $680,000 in hand that will be timely for this project. The other proffers we likely will not have in hand at the time we need to be paying contractors to build the school. And so I've just suggested here we use the $680,000 in developer proffers and use $2 million from water sale proceeds for this illustration. Our annual debt service would be $935,000 minus the savings and pension costs from case one, and you have $235,000 of net annual cost, or 0.6 cents. We can run other scenarios. We can run scenarios where it's fully paid for, but these are just two illustrations. Ultimately, in terms of when we really start talking about tax rates, we need to be mindful that the Mount Daniel aspect of the 2016 budget is less than 1% of all the inputs that you're going to have to determine what your FY16 budget is going to be. And so it's very hard at this point to really talk in any sure sense about what the tax rate would be for FY16, but this is trying to put it into that context. A couple other issues we just note on the last page: timing. What we are planning to do and what we would recommend to do is issue the debt for the full project costs in December in 2014. But it's a reasonable question. Should we break it into smaller chunks? We'll have about a 12 to 18 month permit process with Fairfax County, over which time we would be paying debt service on this bond. The reason we would recommend that we do go to market in December, I think it's probably best, we can't guess what interest rates are going to be, but if you look on the chart on the next page, you do see that we are very close to the historic lows, which were occurring in 2012 at 2%. We're about 80 basis points above those historic lows right now. There's probably a consensus of opinion out there in the marketplace that these rates are going to go higher. And so if you consider what a 200 basis point change would be, municipal bonds changed by 200 basis points in about 5 months, a year and a half ago. So if we went to market in an interest rate environment 200 basis points higher, that would cost us possibly about $3 million more over the life of that 20-year bond. And so that's the reason why we would say this is probably a favorable time to go to market and not break it into smaller chunks. But we can certainly have a council discussion about that. In terms of process, the council actions that would be called for on the 14th, we'd like to bring to you at your next work session a resolution. I'm sorry, on the 14th, we have scheduled the budget amendment for the use of I think I've got my things messed up here. So on the 14th, we will have the budget amendment for the use of water sale proceeds, not bond proceeds. On October 20th, we have the work session to review the Mount Daniel bond resolution. On the 27th, we would have second reading on the use of water sale proceeds. And then on November 10th is when we were scheduled to have the council action on the bond resolution, and then we would go to market in December. And so in that action on the bond resolution, the council could authorize up to a certain amount and have that be permissive, and we wait until we go to market, make the final decision as to how much bonds we want to issue. Or we can have that discussion and really engage strategically as to the plan of finance for this. The prior council actions up to this point have been to debt finance the full amount, but with the water sale proceeds and proffers, we do have other options.
Okay, I tell you, there's a lot to chew off. I wonder if we should just sort of take this step by step instead of doing it in a scattershot approach. And I think the idea is that we're talking through these issues. We're not going to vote on anything tonight or on Monday as far as financing goes. Obviously, the referendum has to be decided before we'll take any action. Maybe one of the first things that we could talk about is 20-year versus 30-year. Some of your analysis show a 30-year bond, some show 20. I wonder if you could discuss a little bit, Mr. Shields, historically. I understand we've done 20-year financing, the pros and cons between the two, and maybe get some sense from the council as to ideas, at least initial sense of council's direction.
Well, I'd like Mr. LeCondre to join in this discussion as well, but in the simplest way, with the 30-year structure, you will have a lower debt service, but a larger overall cost. And so you can see for the level principal compared to level principal, it's about a $3 million increase in cost by going from 20 years to 30 years. The other aspect of it that we do pay attention to, and we're in good shape on, but in the council's policies for debt, you have the goal of having a payout ratio that is sustainable. So in other words, you're paying off your principal in a responsible way and not trying to backload your obligations down the road for future taxpayers. And you have a good, healthy payout ratio right now, and that's because we traditionally do 20-year debt. If we were to do all of our debt with 30 years debt, then we would start to be pushing more and more load out to our taxpayers of the future, which will just make things more difficult for them.
And unlike some of the other projects we've done, you know, with a school structure in particular, I mean, you can say that it has a 40 to 50 year life, so financing it over 30 years is not uncommon, all right? And again, the cost is greater, but your debt load is smaller. And under the plan that we've been talking about, if you're using your interest from the pension fund to finance it, it's not costing you anything.
Cost, I mean, it certainly cost.
Well, it certainly, it cost you, it cost you the $4 million or or the $3 million more, but you're generating interest to cover it.
But you generate more interest for other uses.
Well, if you're using level debt, you still have money available to bond too.
Could I ask a question about
Sure.
that?
It's a big debate.
Richard, let's say that we undertook to finance it over 30 years and that at some point down the line, at 7, 8, 10 years, we found ourselves in the position to be able to pay it off at a more accelerated rate. Is that possible in the way that you could do that for, say, your house loan?
You can make the bonds callable at particular intervals, but there is a additional cost associated with it.
And does that additional cost, rise to the level of?
It doesn't make it prohibitive. It's just an additional cost, and you have to be prepared to address that call option when it comes up.
I mean, I would just say, if I could editorialize, it's unlikely we'd want to pay off a low interest rate bond, 10 years from now when interest rates are 6%. To let's take a bunch of cash and put them in. It's like paying off your 3% mortgage.
Right,
I
sure.
suspect it'd be
I mean,
unlikely that we would want to do that at any point.
That might well be true. The second question is the expected life of the building has been represented to us as 50 years for the facility and at least 30 years or so for the capacity. In other words, the facility that's built itself is expected to last for half a century, and it might require some additional work after 30 years. So from a shared generational burden point of view, what do other jurisdictions do in terms of spreading the cost load of a facility that's going to benefit children starting 4 years from now or 3 years from now, and children starting 43 years from now?
Okay. Are you speaking of setting aside money so that when that building is near the end of its useful life, you have money to pay for it?
Well, I'm more thinking in terms of is it fair for today's taxpayers to bear what some might say would be disproportionate to editorialize here, share of the cost when it is a facility that the future generations of parents ought to be putting their fair share into as well? You don't have to answer that question because you know where I'm going. I mean,
generational equity. I think
exactly, generational. Thank you very much for
part
that
of the- part
soundbite.
of the-
My last question is, $4 million today is not the same thing as, or whatever your delta number is here, doesn't have the same value as $4 million 30 years from now or 40 years from now, right? I mean, $4 million 40 years from now, 30 years from now it's like half that, right? I mean, if inflation even marches at the modest pace, is that factored into these considerations? These are today's dollars numbers, right?
Yes.
Okay, so it's actually not as big a number in real terms going out. Okay, thanks.
Anyone else have any comments about thoughts of whether we want to bond for 20 years or 30 years with this? I mean, I would say in general, my thought would be to try to pay things off as soon as you can and run a tight ship financially, but I'm not wedded to that. And it sounds like we've traditionally done that as well on our other projects historically, so for whatever that's worth. And we're not making decisions tonight, we're just sort of talking things through and maybe offering some input to the extent we're able to Mr. Shields. Okay, well, unless anyone else has got any input on that portion of it, why don't I move on to another issue, which is to bond in November, even though the bills won't become due for at least a year, maybe a year and a half afterwards. It's really associated with risk, right? I mean, because if you're bonding, if you've got a year and a half worth of permits, you're not going to have any bills come due. And it may even be longer than that. If we were to use proffer money, for example, the first bills are going to be small bills, and so it may be 2 years before we really would actually use the proceeds of a bond, depending on how much we bond. Any thoughts on going to bond or going to market, as Mr. Shields has suggested, in November, as opposed to possibly waiting until the money is needed? Mr. Z?
Well, as much as we can, I think we should all work toward reducing uncertainty and being able to predict with some accuracy when that uncertainty might happen, so. Yeah, I don't mean to speak in riddles. So if the sense is that, that we bond, we should bond, the appropriate amount, while we know what the rates are.
Okay, any other thoughts? And what would the rates be today, for example, on either a 20 or 30-year bond?
Anywhere between 3 and 3.5, 3.7.
So it'd be 3 for a 20-year and 3.7 for a 30-year?
Well, when you go to market, there's actually, I mean, we like to try to simplify it and say, you know, it's a 3.2% rate, but in fact, there's sort of layers of financing, so it ends up being a little bit of a range of interest rates.
But so the range is higher for the longer term of the debt. So what is the range for 20-year and what is the range for 30-year?
Not sure, is Davenport giving us that?
No, they just give us a composite because, again, it depends on when you draw the money down.
Yeah, but all things being equal, the
All
rates are
things being
different.
equal, the
What's the
rate-
difference between the two, 20 to 30-year, half point?
Maybe a half point, probably less.
Okay, so the rate we might look at for 20 years could be 3%. The rate for 30 years could be 3.5%.
Or 3 and a quarter.
If there's any
yeah.
insight you can give to that at a later meeting, I think that'd be helpful to know and come into play for people's discussion. Ms. Conley?
Wait, you gave us the drawbacks for bonding in 2 separate chunks. What are the positives? How much would we be paying in bond interest with money that we haven't spent?
You just pay it later, and you, I mean, that's the benefit of it is that you take on the debt when the project is, when you're paying the bills, and so you smooth that out, or you don't take on that expense until you absolutely have to. But in terms of the overall cost of it, you're not paying more. You're just if you do it in December this year, if you did the whole thing, you're not paying more. You're just paying it sooner. Right. So it is a there's one more transaction cost if you do it in two bites or more than 2 bites, and there's the interest rate risk. And the interest rate risk is the compelling one, I think, from our financial advisor's perspective. That's the compelling piece for decision support.
Okay. Any other comments on that? Why don't we talk a little bit about the use of the proffer money? And it's not generic proffer money. This is money for schools, correct? This is the money that we have sought and received in projects for school costs, capital costs associated with the new developments we've approved recently. Is that correct?
Correct.
So this isn't amorphous money that's a community benefit.
Contractually obligated to use it for this purpose.
Okay. Does anyone have any issue with using it for schools at this time? In other words, putting it towards this particular school as opposed to holding it for some later school capital use?
Yeah, right. I guess that would be my question. I mean, it seems very important to try to communicate to people that, you know, the levers that we're pulling here are resources that we actually have. You know, the water sale proceeds, that's a hard figure. You know, the investment from the pension fund, that's a hard data figure. The proffers, some of the money is in hand, some is to come down the line, correct? I mean,
Yes.
The disaster scenario, of course, is that for some reason, you know, one of the big holes that's in the ground now doesn't get a building in it because something bad happens. And if we've committed to using proffer money that we expect from that building but don't yet have, then we got to find some way to make that up. Is that where we would be?
That's
Well,
correct.
How much if we used just the money that we actually have in hand right now for school proffers? How much money would that be?
680,000.
That's what your figure is. Okay.
I would say this, though, that a couple of things. One, we can go back to the bond market up, right? Because this is a capital, this is something that would be appropriate. If the $4 million or the $360,000 additional money did not come through, we could seek additional bond funding, correct?
Correct.
I mean, it seems to me that if we were to keep this money, let's hold it in our hip pocket for another 5 years, let's say, until we have some other need, that the money actually erodes in value. So that, for example, we put it in the bank at 0.1%, which is about what we get, correct, on our money that we have sitting around. So a tenth of 1%, maybe the same as you get in your bank money. Well, 5 years from now, $4.2 million is not going to be worth $4.2 million. And so every year that money erodes. And so, to my mind, using it sooner as opposed to later is a rational decision. I don't know if others feel the same way, but it seems to me kind of holding it for that rainy day is something that has cost.
I guess on this specific topic, I've now heard two very different numbers. I've heard 4.2 million, and then I heard 680,000. Could we clarify?
Yeah, if you look
What-
at this
Yeah.
chart on your first page,
Yeah,
the 680 is the north gate,
right.
and then that's due now. And then we have 2 million for Tenor Hill and 1.5 million for Harris Teeter. Those are due in 2017.
So we really do have in hand just the $680,000 at this
Correct.
point. Okay, I think that's very important.
I guess I would say counter to that, that we don't need the extra money until about the same time. In other words, we don't have school bills now. We won't have school bills when the referendum passes. We won't have school bills for a year to 18 months because it takes that long to permit through Fairfax County. So it's approximately 2017 when the bills start coming in anyway. I agree that there is some risk associated with what if those holes stay there and they're not built out, in which case we don't get the money. But to me, that is a risk that I think that I'm willing to at least consider taking. But it is something I think we should all discuss and consider as a possible way to fund this, the risk associated with it, and I think that's a valid one. Does anyone else have any comments on using this proffer money?
You've said it well, Mayor.
I guess I want to talk this one through a bit more.
Sure.
We don't need to do it tonight, but I don't, so you would issue a bond theoretically in 2014, and you would do what with the money that we don't get till 2017?
Do
I mean, what-
nothing with it. It would just, we don't have any bills to pay with it, so it's not needed. In other words,
Right.
this school's going to not get started at the earliest, maybe let's say 18 months from now. And then in 18 months from now, the bills start coming in, but it doesn't come in as a $15 million bill. It comes in as a $1 million bill for the work done the first month. Second month, maybe it's another $1 million bill. So in other words, you pay as the construction progresses.
I
And
know.
so if you got a bond, let's say for $10 million, that would take care of the first 10 months maybe of construction. And then that last $4 million would be coming from your proffer money, would be paid at a time when you would need it. And it's likely to come before that if it's 2017.
I'd be reluctant because you're in essence assuming that you're going to get that 2017 money right now. Your financial plan would be based on that. I'm reluctant to go that far with that money.
Okay,
But worth talking through.
sure, understood. Any other comments?
If you
Ms.
wouldn't mind,
Messer?
I just would like to clarify that there will be expenditures for the Mount Daniel project prior to the actual large construction after permitting, because there are costs to permitting and designing and some of that work. So it all won't be 18 months down the road. There's some upfront work that the schools will be expending money. Some of that's coming out of the 1 million that's already been issued, but you can't wait 18 months to expend money. There will be some smaller amounts. It just won't be the large construction costs. I didn't want anybody to think there's no expenditures related to this project while the design work and the permitting fees with the county are undergoing.
That's true, but if we go to market as suggested in November, we're going to have a big pot of money. It's
Yes.
basically burning a hole in our pocket for.
I just wanted to make sure it was clear that there would be expenditures between
So-
now and the permitting process.
So we would have essentially $10 million in hand, and then at the end of the project, we would anticipate these projects coming online. We'd get the $4 million, and we'd pay our last bills with that $4 million. I think it is scheduling is tight. I think that's the only concern with that, and so I think we just need to maybe talk with schools about that scheduling and see if they sync up in a way that's comfortable.
Clearly, that needs some more study as to the timing of both the school and Harris Teeter and Tenor Hill. as to anticipated completion days. But essentially, these funds will be due at CO time, correct? In other words, when they get their certificate of occupancy?
Correct.
So they would have an incentive to make the payment as well because they couldn't get a CO until they made the payment.
That's right.
Okay. Is there any more discussion about this, Ms. Conley?
It's just about the timing of this. It says due 2017. Is that early 2017, late 2017? And when is the Mount Daniel project expected to be done?
Yeah, well,
I mean, you hate
these
to
are
have a
big
12-month
complex
swing
projects,
there.
and so I didn't feel confident
Yeah.
in me saying on what day, what month these things are going to be done. But, so it's
So-
rough.
Can you tell us what day they'll be done then?
I can. Yeah.
Sometime during 2017.
So, but if we can't get some more clarity, the point's well taken
Yeah.
all the way around, and we know that you can't be held to a developer's schedule. But if you could, during the coming days, try to get a better idea from the developer of each project when they think they'll come online, and then also with respect to the school, maybe their best case scenario and a more realistic scenario.
Yeah.
And so we can weigh when things may come in and the risk that would be that things don't work out exactly right and what kind of gap there is and what we're exposing ourselves to.
Can I say one more thing?
Yes, of course, Ms. Conley.
So the charts that I've seen on Mount Daniel is that referendum November. If it passes, then they start building in the summer of 2015, and the school is done in the summer of 2016. October, right, 2016. So is that too much of a swing?
That's why I was like,
Yeah.
it makes me nervous. But we'll get these schedules nailed down and get that information to council.
So, I mean, I've heard a scheduling time and Fairfax County processing time of 12 to 18 months, and maybe that's not accurate, maybe that's too long, but if that's the case, then I think sticking a shovel in the ground this summer sounds a bit optimistic to me.
I think they're hoping to get a demolition permit while the 2230, while some of the permitting is going through. Is that?
That's a little scary, I gotta say, starting to tear down something. But anyway, that's probably for another day. But anyway, if you could seek some clarity, some more information about that, and then we can have maybe a better discussion on our end about what kind of process we want to go forward. Are there other thoughts on this that we ought to be discussing in terms of just in general? Ms. Oliver?
Just a question. When was the last time, if ever, we had gotten proffers for school construction? And did we spend it all immediately?
The last big chunk of proffers that we got in went to Mount Daniel expansion. There was a big chunk of it that went to it. We used some of it to defease some debt, if I recall, like in the 2008 time frame. So we had existing debt, and we essentially shaved off some of the cost of it with the proffers. So we did dispose of it quickly. And looking ahead at the school CIP, I'm pretty sure that they will have lots of ways for it to be disposed of quickly in the future. But
So one thing too, which is a related point I'd like to at least make now, and we've discussed this previously, I think we ought to be looking to make sure our school proffer number is accurate. Because with a $100 million high school, if we're not seeking the proper numbers from developers, then we're doing ourselves a disservice. And we should be neutral on these things. When we look at apartments and things like that, we should say this will not impact our budgets with capital costs because we're being made whole by all the new students who are going to arrive there. And so I would say to the extent we're not doing that, we ought to. And I would just ask you to revisit that number, and I know in the context of this project that's before us, there is some consideration of that.
That's right.
But I think we ought to be looking at that very closely in the coming weeks because we have a project that may be voted on in the next 6 weeks. And one other thing that we've discussed before is the idea of maybe doing this on a per square foot basis, not on a per unit basis, because a per unit basis gives an incentive to have larger units and somehow skews possibly what we might want from a project and what a developer might want. It just creates some incentives that may not be tied directly to the development. So I would just ask that maybe you could take a look at that once again and see if we can come up with a number that is on a per square foot basis. Mr. Duncan?
Are we moving to another topic, or? Sure. I'm just curious how this discussion relates to the case studies that you've laid out here. Both case 1 and case 2 rely on some use, significant use of proffers, which is fine. I mean, certainly it's an option, and more information we're going to get on that. Could we have another case 3 that would show the net tax rate equivalence if we did not rely on proffers, but rather relied on just a buy down of the cost of the bond? That would bring it to the point where the tax rate equivalence would be 0. I mean, you've got a net tax rate equivalence of 0.6 cents. We're pretty close to even on that method getting to 0. At any rate, could by Saturday we just show the community, because that is the question that's asked, you know, how much is this thing going to cost me on the tax rate? And can we show a scenario where that number is 0 and we rely on a bond number? So we would use the pension proceeds as a perpetual way to fund about 2 cents of it, and we would use a portion of the remaining 8 or 9 million to buy down the cost of the Mount Daniel bond, so that it would show one pathway. Obviously, as the mayor says, we can't guarantee anything at this point about how we're going to act on the budget in April. But if we were showing that here, if we could just show that third option, that would be helpful, I think.
Ms.
I guess I would just like to make the point that I think that case 1, case 2, and even case 3 that you've just described are a little bit misleading to the public. I think that if we look at the first page, it says that the tax rate equivalent of the bond, which is going out to referendum, is 2.4 cents to 3.9 cents. And if we follow case 1 or case 2, we can create an image of a smaller rate. But the reality is there's an opportunity cost. There's what we're not spending those funds on. So I think, you know, the public needs to understand that whether it impacts the tax rate or whether it means we don't spend money on something else, that in approving this referendum, that's what they're saying, that they're, you know, and if you translate that into a percentage, we're talking a couple percentage of the budget. That's the commitment that people are making. And I just don't know that we're doing anybody a service by trying to make it look like it's costing less.
If I could, I'm sorry.
No.
I think that's a well taken point. I think it's very important, as we've all said, that we convey that the use of the water sale proceeds, which was, you know, it was a pain in the ass, but it was a perpetually performing asset for us, the water system. The use of the water sale proceeds needs to be, as close as possible, a perpetually performing asset for only the most significant long-term capital needs. At least that's my opinion. And so I think it's correct that in the discussion about, you know, whether we might apply some of these proceeds to Mount Daniel, the community assess whether they believe that that is a significant enough long-term community need to warrant any of the approaches we're suggesting here, case 1, case 2, case 3. I think everyone on council definitely wants to apply the proceeds and the approach to that kind of a asset, not anything that would be a recurring operational expense.
Vice Mayor Snyder.
I'd like to address my comments to those of Councilmember Oliver and totally agree with her. I've watched the community discussion, and the reality is that this project is going to cost $15.6 million. Now, you can fund it out of tax rate, you can fund it out of savings, if you will, but that has opportunity costs. And so we're not the federal government. We can't print money. We're not the state where you can run up huge pension deficits and claim that you're a well-funded, well-run state. So I've had a little bit of difficulty with I think it's good to lay out potential ways we could go. But I think in all honesty, we've got to say the cost is $15.6 million, and people ought to decide whether they want to support this project, realizing its costs, whether you pay for it out of tax rate or you pay for it out of water proceeds or however you pay for it. And my concern is that, and I think Karen spelled it out, that depending on how you present these, it's going to look like, oh, this is painless because we're doing it this way. Well, the reality is the pain's the same. It's $15.6 million, and that's the decision the community needs to make. And I'm really concerned about we're somehow deflecting it into arguments over, you know, whether you do it this way or that way, which is very important, and we need to work those out. But I don't want us to lose fact that the basic decision here is, are we going to support the schools and pay the money to do it, and we understand this project and we're willing to support it, or we're not? So I think this is a very good discussion, and I think as we learn more, this is going to be very helpful for us in our decision-making process. But I don't want us to do something that creates the impression that it's anything other than what it is, which is it's $15.6 million to do what is described otherwise.
If I could, Mr. Mayor, those are very, very good points. You know, what I'm hearing in the community is it's sort of two questions. One, why do we need to do Mount Daniel? And two, does anybody have any idea how we're going to pay for it? You know, the why do we need to do Mount Daniel is really on the school board to explain, and they have, you know, put forward information to make that case. Do we have any idea how we're going to pay for it is the discussion that you and I, and we're all talking about here right now. And I just, you know, think it's useful, and we are doing it, so that's good. We're having a discussion well in advance of when you've been here for many big projects like this, well in advance of when we usually talk about how we're going to pay for a big project, talking about how we're going to pay for it. And I do feel like there's a difference out there in the community now. There's more interest. Perhaps it's because, you know, assessments have been up, taxes are up. I don't know why, but there's more interest in, you know, do you have a plan? And hopefully the fact that we're discussing it will be, you know, made note of. And yeah, we've got 2 or 3 ways to do it that are all responsible and reasonable. And we'll pick one, you know, when the appropriate time comes. And we'll pick it in April, probably, in the context of our revenue performance. I mean, if revenue performance is what we think it is right now, you know, both the schools and the city side will be able to increase spending, I think Mr. Condrey says, by 4.5%, which is a, you know, pretty healthy number. If the revenue projections tail off, which is possible, given the situation at the state level, as you know, things are a little dicey now. So we can't guarantee 4.5%, but, you know, as we sit here right now, almost any of these plans, approaches that we're talking about would enable us to give both general government operations and schools, you know, reasonable FY 15-16 budget increases. So that's all really we have to do, I think, in the next month, is just assure people that we didn't just, you know, take something that was pushed to us by the school board and say, yep, looks good to me. You know, we have thought about how we're going to try to finance the thing.
Yeah, in case 3 or 4, case 3 could be you fund it out of the tax rate and the additional money you put aside for the new high school. I mean, and I'm not saying I necessarily advocate that, but that sort of thing gives people, I think, the ranges of the kinds of things that we'll be working on. But I think makes the point that regardless of how you fund it, it's $15.6 million, and the decision is, does the community support spending $15.6 million to do the Mount Daniel project, or doesn't it?
Mr. Baruch?
Well, I just want to align my sentiments with both Vice Mayor Snyder and Councilmember Oliver. I think that's absolutely right. I mean, there's really no, pardon the pun, a free lunch with this. The 15 million is fungible. I mean, we could have a development project tomorrow that shows up, and part of the profit package is that they build a new school, but that's still $15 million that the developer wouldn't have put towards You Pick It, library, or parks. So at the end of the day, the taxpayer is going to pay for this project one way or the other. So I think we just need to be transparent with that, perhaps the simplest way of doing it is that the 15 million is they're trying to get a better sense of, the range, because that is a pretty broad range between 800 and 1.38 mil. I think we need to refine that for the public, just so they know what the debt service is, because that's really the cost, and how we're going to fund that. It's gonna be a different scenario every year. It could be a series of tax increases and cuts, but the bottom line is, it's any way you slice it, it's gonna be cents on the tax rate is the only sort of way I think that you can look at it and be transparent. And there's different ways that you get there, but at bottom, that's what it's gonna boil down to. And I just don't want to be clever by half, or whatever the expression is, to try to, make this more complicated than it is, because it's really not. We got to figure out what the debt service cost is, figure out what that means on the tax rate, and that's what it is, and we're going to have various options of meeting that.
Okay, any other comments, or should we wrap up this discussion? Is there anything else that needs to be said at this time? Okay, well then let's go ahead and wrap this up. Our next item on the agenda, I think it's really was just a carryover from a prior issue. I don't know if there really needs to be much to be said on it. I know.
Mr. Mayor, I'm sorry, before we leave that,
Yep.
I just want to make sure that the documents,
The agenda?
the
Okay.
documents that go out to the public reflect the correction and wording on the upcoming council action timetable.
Yeah.
So that it's clear to the public that we do plan on October 27th to have a public hearing and second reading on use of the water sale proceeds. Right? That's how I understood you to
That is
say that.
correct.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so I've got the corrected agenda. So are there any council comments, scheduling issues? Mr. Z?
Just a
Thank
quick
you all
one-
for coming, those of you who are leaving. Mr. Z?
Yes, thanks. How's the ULI TAP session shaping up? Any changes? Anything else we need to know about it?
It's the Urban Land Institute Technical Assistance Panel, which is scheduled for the 15th and the 16th. And I will get out to council a more refined schedule. I've sent out sort of a kind of a broad schedule, and we'll get out more details on that this week, as well as the list of questions, the panelists, and a good packet for the council.
So for those of you who don't know, this is in furtherance of the steering committee and the planning for the George Mason High School property. And so through Mr. Z's leadership, we applied for a grant, and the Urban Land Institute, which is a premier land group, a lot of developer, architects, just a lot of firepower. They're going to come and analyze this property and give us some ideas and respond to some questions that we put together. Those questions are being honed, but on the 15th and the 16th, they're going to be at the Hilton Garden Inn, taking a tour of the property, but hold up and try to give us some answers, or what they believe answers are, to some of the questions we have, such as what's the highest and best use for the property? What gives us the best long-term value, long-term return on this property? What's the best mix of this and that? So there's a series of questions that have been produced, and Mr. Shields can send those off to council. They're still being honed just a bit. Ms. Connolly and Mr. Snyder particularly participated as well. But it would be great if council could attend, and Mr. Shields, if you can let council know when the appropriate times are. But there is a stakeholder meeting, which is where they can interact with us and others to get ideas, our specific ideas as to what our vision for that property is. And it'd be good to have as many people as possible to attend that. The second day in the evening, they're going to present their findings. In other words, this is what we think we should do there. These are our recommendations. Here's the answers to your questions. And it'd be great if folks could attend that as well. But it's a pretty big deal, and I think it's very exciting for the city. Okay, any other comments, Mr. Duncan?
Just a question about the various emails that came in. I saw some, while I was away, I saw some discussion about the DMV Select issue. I'm just wondering if before or on Tuesday, we could have some conversation about that involves the Commissioner of the Revenue and where we stand on it. That's something we can talk about before then if you want, but I've been assigned the task by the mayor of resolving this issue, and you know,
All the other issues.
that makes me the dirty jobs guy here. So I'm gonna wear my dungarees and my blue sweater, but
I think the commissioner runs the program, and so what would be, I think what we need is what would need to happen to make it sustainable from a workload perspective, space perspective, and so we will work with the commissioner.
And how much it'll cost.
And yeah, exactly.
just to get the discussion started, yeah, I mean, you know, when I last tuned in to this last Thursday, my question was, could we operate the service, say, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, to help the staff and space situation, to, you know, make it predictable so that city residents would be aware when they could come and do their business. And I was given to understand that perhaps there was some contract language, the city attorney may want to dial into this too, that requires it to be operated Monday through Friday. And I just wonder if there is some flexibility to that. You know, at the VML on the budget presentation, I picked up some of the paper, and of course, given the cutbacks at the state level that are anticipated, who knows if they'll even, you know, be running the superstore out at Tyson's, the DMV out at Tyson's, as much as they even do now. So that would put more of a burden on our jurisdiction to be the, you know, DMV provider for near and Northern Virginia, which is, I think, not something that we want to do. And the point was that, you know, when the state is making cutbacks, if they're not paying their fair share, then standards, requirements, and deadlines should change. And, you know, local jurisdictions should exert some pressure back the other way. I don't know. That's just one possible solution that perhaps we could discuss with the Commissioner of the Revenue. Thank you.
Okay. Vice Mayor Snyder?
Just before we part, this, right, I know.
We're not going anywhere.
Well, let me be brief. I think on this document, we need some sort of Surgeon General's warning. We need a draft, or we need it stipulated that this was discussed, because
It's just a
this may take
discussion.
on a life of its own that none of us intends. So.
This would
I
be
don't-
the Snyder Plan document.
No,
right?
that's, yeah.
I think
Thank
it's a
you.
good idea. Mr. Baruch?
I have one suggestion, given that it looks like we've got a fairly light calendar on the 14th, and other work sessions are gonna get even more busy, would it be possible to at least have the budget amendment discussion sort of as we outlined in a work session format? I know staff hates that, but just so we're making productive time, since we're all gonna be there, rather than trying to tack it on to the 20th work session, which looks already pretty busy.
Would the council be open to that, to use the 14th to have some more kind of informal work session type discussions on these budgetary items? We'll provide much more information about them, and but the only way we can make progress on them is to really work with council on identifying the priorities, just like we would with any budget decision. And if we want to use Tuesday night for that purpose, it is a fairly late agenda.
We can't, I mean, I don't know if we can discuss this offline about how it mechanically might work, but I think we need to figure out the mechanics of it, but I'm certainly open to it if others are as well. All right, sounds like we sort of have a consensus on that. Why don't we work together and try to figure out the mechanics of how that might work.
All right.
If I could also mention, there are some changes to the Virginia Conflict of Interest laws coming up, and so you ought to be aware of that. I've asked our city attorney to kind of be a resource for that, but I think you ought to keep that in mind. There are going to be more reportings than were required previously, so it looks like it's going to be twice a year to make certain reportings as opposed to once a year. So just keep that in mind, that there are going to be some changes, and you ought to be aware of them. And I know our city attorney will work with us to make sure we're on board with that, but just keep that in mind. We got this, and there's more to come.
Yeah, actually, if I could, just for a second, I went to the forum at VML about that, and it's really a burden on the city clerk because, whenever you go anywhere, any of us go anywhere, and, the city pays more than, what's the figure, like $200 or something, then that all has to be itemized in much more detail, as I understood it, than has been the case in the past. So it's going to require, more work, another unfunded mandate.
Okay, well, why don't we go ahead and then, Ms. Oliver?
I just wanted to make a comment to council about the library board meeting. I referred to this earlier, but they had a preliminary discussion with the consultant who's helping them try to rework their submission for the CIP. And I just wanted to make clear that of the $8 million budget that was in the CIP, one of the things the library consultant made clear was that as soon as they add the first square foot, they need to spend about $4 million just to bring the rest of the building up to code. So half of that money is going towards bringing it up to code, and then they will be quite limited in terms of what they can add. The consultant is working a little bit in a vacuum because he doesn't know what the parking structure possibility might be, and that's affecting the design. Those two items were both among the things that we might discuss on Monday night, and I just think they're really critical.
Thank you. Keep that in mind then, Mr. Shields, if you could, for preparing for, I guess, Tuesday night. Okay, well, listen, why don't we go ahead? I guess we can go in a closed session right now and then take a 5-minute break and then come back and shut the doors and do with that. So why don't we go ahead and get started on our closed session. We're not going to discuss anything for a moment or two. We thank you all in the public for coming this evening. We are going to go to a closed session in here. Yes. Oh, you are? Okay, it's one of the, go ahead.
There's one that's related to school properties.
Okay.
And so we could do that one first.
We'll do that one first. Okay, sounds good. So upon a motion made by Councilmember Snyder and seconded by Councilmember
Connolly.
and passed by a voice vote of City Council, Council went in a closed session pursuant to Virginia Code Section 2.2-3711A3 for the discussion or consideration of the acquisition of real property for a public purpose or for the disposition of publicly held real property where discussion in an open meeting would adversely affect the bargaining position or negotiating strategy of the public body. Park Place, Thomas Jefferson Elementary School expansion. Councilmember Baruch? Yes. Councilmember Conley? Yes. Councilmember Duncan?
Yes.
Councilmember Oliver?
Yes.
Councilmember Snyder? Yes. Councilmember Z?
Yes.
Councilmember Tartar? Okay. Let's go ahead and take a 5-minute break, and then we come back in. We're going to shut the doors and go into closed session.